He had $43 in his wallet, a daughter who still believed in him, and a piece of paper that said he owned 11 acres of cracked Nevada desert. That was it. That was everything. The developers who'd laughed at him this morning didn't know what he'd found inside that hangar. Neither did the woman who just stepped out of a black SUV wearing a suit that cost more than his truck. The woman who walked through those rusted doors, looked across the dark concrete floor, and stopped breathing. She recognized something, and whatever it was going to change both their lives forever. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. The auction paperwork was still folded in Ethan Mercer's jacket pocket, creased down the middle, a little damp from where he'd sweated through the drive. He didn't take it out. He didn't need to read it again. He had the numbers memorized the way a man memorizes a scar. $87,400 for 11.3 acres of federally listed commercial land in Ridgecrest County, Nevada, including one decommissioned airfield, one deteriorating maintenance hangar, access to a defunct water line, and this was the part the county assessor had practically laughed while reading aloud. Associated structures and any contents therein sold as is. As is. Ethan had repeated those words to himself during the 5-hour drive from Bakersfield. As is. He said them again now as he stood at the edge of the property, one boot on cracked asphalt, one in pale desert sand, looking at what $87,400 and the last of his mother's life insurance had bought him. It looked like the end of something, not a beginning. The airfield was maybe a quarter-mile of runway, sun-bleached to the color of old bone. Creosote bushes had pushed up through fissures at the far end, and a chain-link fence along the south perimeter had buckled in sections, leaning inward like a man too tired to stand straight. The control tower, if you could call it that, it was really just a 2-story box with blown-out windows, cast a long shadow across the tarmac in the late afternoon light, and the hangar sat at the north end, enormous, its corrugated metal walls the rust orange of dried blood, one of its 2 massive rolling doors slightly ajar, darkness visible in the gap. Behind Ethan, his truck idled. He'd left the engine running because the AC worked better when the RPMs were up, and because his daughter was still asleep in the back seat, and because some part of him wasn't entirely ready to shut the engine off and make this real. He turned back and looked through the windshield. Lily was curled against the door, a thin blanket pulled up to her chin even though it was 91 degrees outside. She was 11 years old and she slept the way she'd slept since she was an infant, completely still, hands tucked under her cheek, expression unreadable. She hadn't complained once during the drive, hadn't asked where they were going or why, or what would happen to her school enrollment. She just climbed in the truck at 6 in the morning with her backpack and her beat-up copy of My Side of the Mountain and a gas station breakfast burrito, and she'd said, "Okay, Dad." 2 words. "Okay, Dad." Like she'd already done the math on her options and decided trust was the only currency she had left. That thought sat in Ethan's chest like a fishhook. He turned back to the hangar. "All right," he said to no one. "Let's see what we got." The padlock on the main door had been listed in the auction documents as secured with county-issued lock, combination available upon transfer of deed. What the county had failed to mention was that the combination lock had been replaced at some point with a keyed padlock, a heavy, commercial-grade Medico that was absolutely, categorically not county-issued and had no key on record anywhere. Ethan stood in front of it for a moment, hands on his hips. Then he walked around the building. The hangar was roughly 200 feet across and maybe 160 feet deep, large enough to have serviced small jets or multiple light aircraft simultaneously. The corrugated walls showed decades of exposure, patches of oxidation, a section near the back that had been spot welded at some point, what looked like a repair job after a vehicle impact near the east corner. The whole structure sat on a poured concrete pad that extended about 30 feet beyond the south wall, cracked and oil-stained, with a set of rusted tie-down rings embedded in a row, 8 of them, evenly spaced, the kind used to anchor rotor aircraft. He stopped. He crouched down and looked at the rings more carefully. They were T-shaped, recessed flush with the concrete, and they weren't nearly as corroded as they should have been given the overall state of the property. Someone had used them. Not recently, But not 17 years ago either. Maybe 8, 10 years back. He filed that away and kept walking. Around the east corner, he found a personnel door. It was a standard steel utility door, the kind you'd see on the back of any industrial building. Except this one was also padlocked, and the lock was a match to the one on the main door. Same brand, same model. He pressed his hand flat against the metal. It was hot from the sun, and beneath the surface heat, the door felt solid, substantial. Not a building someone had walked away from and forgotten. Someone locked this up, Ethan thought. Someone who came back here more than once. He felt something shift in his stomach. Not dread exactly. Something more like attention. He walked back to the main door and looked at the padlock again. Then he looked at the gap where the rolling door stood open, the main vehicle door on the west wall. He'd been so focused on the locks that he'd missed the obvious. He pushed the rolling door sideways. It moved. Heavy, shrieking on its track with a sound like something long buried objecting to being disturbed. But it moved. The gap widened to 3 feet, 5 feet. Enough. Ethan stepped inside. Quote, the darkness was immediate and total, and it smelled like time. Not rot, not mold or animal decay, or the chemical sour smell of a space that's been sealed too long. Something else. Something drier and older. Mineral and metallic, like the inside of a machine that's been sleeping, like a room full of held breath. He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam swept across concrete, a low-hanging tool rack, the underside of something dark and large. A vehicle, definitely, but he couldn't see the shape of it yet. He moved forward until his hand found the wall, then walked along it looking for a light switch, or a breaker box, or anything that might still be connected to a power source. He found it 12 feet in, a gray metal panel, commercial size, mounted at eye level. He flipped the main breaker. Nothing happened. Then something clicked. Then hummed. Then row by row, banks of overhead fluorescents stuttered to life. 3 of them sputtering and dying immediately. 2 more strobing for 10 seconds before settling into a steady, cold, blue-white glow. And the interior of the hangar revealed itself. Ethan didn't move for a long time. He stood perfectly still with his mouth slightly open and his phone still in his hand, its flashlight now unnecessary and forgotten. There were vehicles inside, not just a few. The space was full of them, arranged with what had once been careful order. 3 rows, 3 vehicles per row, with wide lanes between them for circulation, the way a professional storage facility would do it. Beside them, along the far wall and suspended from what appeared to be a reinforced ceiling beam, hung the rotors of 2 larger aircraft, blades folded. On the ground beneath the beam sat 3 helicopters, their landing skids aligned with geometric precision on a set of yellow-painted lines that had mostly faded. 9 cars, 3 helicopters. They were covered, every single one, in dust cloths of heavy canvas, grayish-white, drooping softly over contours that hinted at form the way fabric draped over sculpture hints at the body underneath. Ethan walked to the nearest car. The dust cloth came off in one pull, and a cloud of particles rose into the fluorescent light and hung there like suspended ash. A Lamborghini Murcielago. Black, not a scratch visible. The paint, under the dust, was still deep and dark and perfect, not faded the way paint fades when it's been left in sun and heat. The tires were slightly flat, but the sidewalls showed no cracking. He crouched down and looked at the wheel well. Clean, suspiciously, impossibly clean. He moved to the next, dust cloth off, a Porsche Carrera GT, silver. Behind it, under a separate cloth, a Ferrari Enzo, red, 1 small scratch across the front bumper that had been started but never repainted. He was breathing faster now, without quite knowing when that had started. He uncovered the 4th car, 5th, 6th, a Maserati MC12, a McLaren F1, a Bugatti Veyron that still smelled faintly, impossibly faintly, of interior leather conditioner. He turned to the helicopters. 2 were covered with tarps matching the style of those on the cars. Heavy, professional, the kind of tarp you buy when you intend to store something for years, not weeks. But the 3rd helicopter, the one in the center position against the far wall, was not under a tarp at all. It was uncovered, and it had been for some time. The dust on its exterior was thicker than on the others, settled into layers that suggested years, not months, of undisturbed accumulation. A Bell 429 variant, silver white, with custom trim that had once been sharp and clean and was now dull with age. The registration numbers along the tail boom were partially obscured by dust, but visible. Its landing skid sat centered on the yellow-painted lines, perfectly aligned, as if whoever had parked it there had taken great care. It was in a way that Ethan couldn't quite articulate the most important thing in the room. He didn't know why he thought that. He just did. He was still staring at it when he heard Lily's voice behind him. "Dad?" He spun around. She was standing in the entrance, backpack on one shoulder, blinking in the harsh fluorescent light, her paperback book still held in one hand. "You were gone for a long time," she said. She looked past him at the cars, at the helicopters. Her eyes widened, but only slightly. Lily had always been sparing with her expressions, as if she kept them in a savings account. "What is all this?" "I don't know yet," Ethan said honestly. She stepped forward, walking between the cars with her head turning slowly left and right, taking inventory the way she did everything, methodically, quietly. She stopped in front of the Bugatti. "Is this a Bugatti Veyron?" "Yeah. Those are worth like—" She pulled out her phone, typed something, looked up. "Dad, those are worth like $2 million. "I know. And there are 9 cars." "I know, Lily." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Did you know about this when you bought the property?" "No," Ethan said. "The listing said contents therein as is. I assumed that meant tools, maybe some old equipment." Lily looked around the hangar again, slowly, taking in the helicopters, the silver one in the center, the whole strange, impossible inventory of it. "Okay," she said finally. "So what do we do?" Ethan looked at the silver helicopter, at the dust on its rotor blades, at the tail registration number half hidden in years of desert particulate. "First," he said, "we document everything. Photos, video, serial numbers, if I can find them. Then we get a lawyer." Lily nodded. "Smart." She said it the same way she'd said okay, Dad that morning. Simple, level, like she'd already done the math and found him adequate. He didn't deserve it, and he knew it, and that was part of why it wrecked him every single time. They slept that night in the truck, parked inside the hangar with the big rolling door pulled most of the way shut. It was still 100 degrees at midnight. The metal walls radiated the day's heat back into the space like a slow oven, and Ethan lay across the front seat listening to the desert outside making its quiet sounds and trying to sequence the problems in front of him. Problem 1. The vehicles. They needed to be documented, appraised, and their legal status determined before Ethan touched a single one. If any of them were stolen, and 9 supercars in a locked hangar on abandoned property in the Nevada desert strongly suggested the possibility. His ownership claim got complicated fast. The auction deed covered contents therein, and he had documentation of that, but a court could argue the property of stolen goods didn't transfer simply by virtue of land sale. Problem 2, the padlocks. Someone had locked this place with commercial-grade hardware that didn't belong to the county. That meant someone had access after the county took possession of the property, that someone might still consider themselves to have a claim. Problem 3, who had owned this property before the county? The public record showed a chain of title that ended with a Nevada LLC called Ridgecrest Holdings, dissolved by the Secretary of State for failure to file annual reports in 2019. Before Ridgecrest Holdings, a Delaware-registered entity called Blackwood Aerospace Technologies, LLC. Ethan had looked that up 3 times on his phone during the evening while Lily organized the photos she'd taken on her own device. He'd found the name in a few archived Nevada business filings, and in a Wikipedia entry, and in a news story from 8 years ago. The search results from before that were sparse, but one result kept appearing. A Business Journal retrospective from 2019, marking the 20th anniversary of a fatal helicopter crash that had killed aerospace pioneer and entrepreneur Richard Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Aerospace Technologies, during a test flight in the Nevada desert. 1999, 25 years ago. Or, wait, he'd done the math wrong. If the crash was in 2007 and the articles said 17 years, he did it again. 2007, 17 years back. He looked at the property records. Blackwood Aerospace had held the deed from 1994 until the dissolution in 2019. The county had acquired it through tax forfeiture in 2020, which meant this hangar and everything in it had been sitting here locked since at least 2019, possibly longer. He lay back and stared at the ceiling of his truck. 9 supercars, 3 helicopters, a silver one that hadn't been covered, like someone expected to come back for it. He fell asleep somewhere around 2 in the morning with that thought still unfinished. The next morning, he drove Lily to a diner 12 miles up the highway for breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee for him, chocolate milk for her, the full meal costing $11 and change. And while she ate, she showed him the photograph she'd taken the night before. She was good, better than he was. She'd thought to get close-ups of the VIN plates, the instrument panels through the windows, the serial number stamped onto the skid frame of the silver helicopter. She'd done them in sequence, labeling each file with the vehicle type and position number, row 1, position 1, row 1, position 2. How did you know to do the VIN plates? Ethan asked. I looked up how to document found vehicles for insurance and legal purposes, she said. She bit into her toast. It's not complicated. You're 11. I know. He shook his head, drank his coffee. Good work, Lily. She didn't say thank you. She never really did, not to compliments about things she'd simply done correctly. She just scrolled to the next photo. This one's weird, she said, and handed him the phone. It was a photo of the tail section of the silver helicopter, dust-covered, tail registration half obscured, but she'd managed to get a shot at an angle where the dust thinned along one of the horizontal stabilizers, and in that patch of relative clarity, stamped into the metal itself, was a partial serial number. The same serial number appeared in the Wikipedia entry he'd found on his phone the night before, attached to a photograph of an aircraft registered to Blackwood Aerospace Technologies, photographed at a Nevada airfield in 2005, 2 years before the crash. Ethan stared at the photo for a long moment. Then he stared at the Wikipedia photo. Then he put the phone down on the table and finished his coffee. Dad? Lily said. Yeah. What does it mean? He didn't answer right away. Outside the diner window, the desert highway ran straight and flat toward the horizon, and a tractor-trailer was making its way west, dwindling slowly into a nothing point of distance. I don't know yet, he said, which was partly true. The other part, the part he wasn't saying, was that he was starting to understand the shape of something, the way you understand the shape of a problem before you know its name. Some problems arrive with their labels attached, and some arrive like this. As a locked hangar full of impossible vehicles, a serial number that shouldn't exist, and the slowly gathering sense that you've stepped into the middle of something someone else started a very long time ago. He spent the next 2 days doing what he knew how to do, working. Ethan had been a mechanic before the divorce, before the lawsuit from his former business partner that had taken his shop and most of his savings, before 18 months of contract work that barely paid rent, before his landlord sold the building in Bakersfield and he'd had 30 days to find somewhere else to go. He knew engines, which meant he knew systems, which meant he knew how to assess a space and figure out what it could become. He cleaned, he documented, he made phone calls. The county clerk's office confirmed his deed. An attorney in Reno who handled commercial real estate, recommended by the auction house, told him that the contents therein language was legally strong and that the burden of proof for any counterclaim lay with whoever might challenge it, not with Ethan. He said this in the careful, qualified way of lawyers everywhere, which meant it was roughly true, but not guaranteed, but it was enough. He also called 3 appraisers. 2 didn't return the call. The third, a collector vehicle specialist named Dave Gutierrez, who operated out of Henderson, listened to Ethan's description with the kind of silence that men use when they're trying not to react audibly. Say that again, Dave said. McLaren F1? Yeah. Bugatti Veyron? Yeah. Ferrari Enzo? Yeah. And you said 3 helicopters? 3. One's a Bell 429 custom variant, silver white. The other 2 I haven't identified yet, under the tarps. There was a pause. Where are you located? Ridgecrest County. There's a county road off Route 178. I'll be there Thursday, Dave said. Don't touch anything. I haven't. Good. Don't talk to anyone about this. I called you. I mean anyone else. He paused again. This kind of inventory you're going to attract attention you don't want. You understand what I'm saying? Ethan understood. He hung up and looked at Lily, who was sitting on a camp chair they'd picked up at a hardware store, reading her book in the slice of morning shade along the east wall of the hangar. Thursday, he said. She turned a page. Okay. Imbibe. The black SUV arrived on Wednesday. Ethan was underneath the truck, a routine oil issue he'd been monitoring for 2 weeks, when he heard it. The crunch of gravel at the entrance gate, which he'd relocked with a new padlock, then an engine idling, then the sound of a car door. He rolled out from under the truck and stood up, wiping his hands on a shop rag. The SUV was a blacked-out Escalade with Nevada plates that were too clean to belong to anyone who'd bought them more than 6 months ago. A driver in a dark jacket stood beside the front door, and walking toward the gate, toward Ethan, was a woman. She was maybe early to mid-40s, with dark hair cut sharp and clean above her collar. She wore a charcoal suit, no tie, collar open, the kind of clothes that cost enough to look effortless. She moved with the contained, economical walk of someone who'd learned a long time ago not to waste motion. Her face was hard to read at this distance, but there was something about the set of her jaw that said she was accustomed to having arrived somewhere before she was expected. She stopped at the gate, looked at the padlock, looked at Ethan. Mr. Mercer? Yeah, he said. He didn't move toward her. My name is Vivian Blackwood. I'm the CEO of Blackwood Technologies. She said it the way you state a number, factually, without expectation of recognition. I'd like to talk to you about this property. Ethan looked at her for a moment, then at the Escalade, then back at her. How'd you find out about this property? Public auction records are publicly available, she said. Her voice was even and unhurried. Your name is on the deed. I have people who track acquisitions that intersect with Blackwood's legacy holdings. Legacy holdings, Ethan repeated. This property was associated with the Blackwood Aerospace Division before it was dissolved. A slight pause. I have no claim to it. I understand the sale was legal and binding. I'm not here to contest anything. I just want to talk. Ethan considered her for another moment. She held his gaze without shifting, without the telltale fidgeting of someone managing impatience. All right, he said. He unlocked the gate. Come in. He led her toward the hangar. He'd left the rolling door open for ventilation during the day, a precaution given the heat, and as they approached, the interior of the building became visible in sections, the rows of dust-clothed vehicles, the fluorescent lights still running on the old breaker he'd switched on 2 days ago, the helicopters along the far wall. Vivian Blackwood walked into the hangar. She stopped. The change was absolute and immediate. One moment she was the composed executive walking with measured purpose, and the next she was something else entirely. Not panicked, not dramatically stricken, just stopped, like a reel of film cutting from motion to a still frame. Her eyes were on the silver helicopter, the uncovered one, the one in the center position, sitting on its faded yellow lines. She didn't speak for a long moment. Ethan watched her. Miss Blackwood, he said. Nothing. Miss Blackwood. She turned to look at him, and he saw something on her face that he hadn't expected. Not calculation, not corporate assessment, something older than that. That helicopter, she said. Her voice had changed. It was quieter now, and careful, the way you speak around something fragile. Where did it come from? As far as I know, it was here when the county took possession of the property, Ethan said. Which means it was here before that. The deed trail goes back to Blackwood Aerospace. I know the deed trail, she said. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the aircraft. I need to get closer. Okay. She walked across the concrete toward the silver helicopter, and Ethan followed 2 steps behind. She stopped in front of it. She reached out and pressed one hand to the fuselage. Not possessively, not like she was claiming it, but slowly, almost reluctantly, the way you touch something you're not sure is real. She crouched down. Along the rear cabin doorframe, at a height of approximately 3 feet from the ground, there was a scratch, diagonal, slightly curved, maybe 4 inches long. Old. The paint around it had yellowed faintly with age, which meant the scratch itself was older still. Vivian Blackwood looked at that scratch for a long time. When she stood up, her face was very still. "I need to sit down," she said. Ethan looked around. The camp chair was outside. "Give me a second," he said, and went to get it. When he came back, she was still standing in front of the helicopter, not moving. He set the chair down beside her, and she sat. He leaned against the workbench across from her and waited. "I made that scratch," she said. Ethan didn't say anything. "I was 8 years old. My father had just taken delivery of this aircraft. He'd had it custom built. It took almost 2 years. He'd let me see the inside, and I was leaning against the doorframe looking at the instrument panel, and I had—" She stopped, exhaled slowly through her nose. "I had a barrette in my hair, the sharp kind. It caught on the paint. My father was furious." A pause. "Not at me. He was never angry at me. He was angry at himself for not catching me in time." She looked at Ethan. "This helicopter burned in a crash in 2007. My father was flying it. There was nothing left. I identified the wreckage myself." She held his gaze and her voice remained level, but underneath the levelness was something taut and close to breaking. "I stood in a field in the Nevada desert, and I looked at the wreckage of this aircraft, and I watched them put what was left of my father into a bag." Ethan said nothing. There was nothing to say. "So tell me," Vivian Blackwood said quietly, "how is it here?" Outside, the desert made no sound. The fluorescent lights hummed. The silver helicopter sat in its yellow-painted lines, patient and intact, keeping whatever it knew to itself. "I don't know," Ethan said, "but I think that's the question we need to answer." He drove into town that evening and bought 2 more camp chairs, a portable folding table, a case of water, and 2 boxes of food from the grocery store. Nothing fancy, crackers and peanut butter and canned soup and a bag of apples. Because Vivian Blackwood had asked to stay, and because Ethan Mercer was not the kind of man who asked someone to leave when they looked like that. When he got back, she was standing outside the hangar looking at the airfield. She'd removed her jacket and rolled up her sleeves in the evening heat. The composed executive posture had softened somewhat, or maybe she'd simply stopped maintaining it, the way a person relaxes in a place where nobody's watching. Lily was talking to her. Ethan could see them from the truck as he pulled in. Lily standing a couple feet away, book in hand, looking up at the taller woman with the focused, unapologetic attention she gave everything she found worth examining. Vivian appeared to be listening. She had the still, patient quality of someone who was genuinely paying attention, which not many adults gave Lily, and Lily had clearly noticed. He got out of the truck. "I looked it up," Lily was saying as he approached. The Bell 429 series, that variant was produced between 2007 and 2013. The custom build specs are different. The one inside looks like it's from an earlier production run. Vivian looked at the girl, then at Ethan, then back at Lily. "You're right," she said. "It was built in 2004. Custom airframe specifications, modified interior configuration, extended fuel range." A pause. "Your daughter is more prepared for this conversation than most professionals I work with." "She does that," Ethan said. Lily looked mildly pleased with herself, which on her face was barely visible, but Ethan could read it. They set up the folding table outside the hangar as the sun dropped toward the western ranges. Ethan opened cans of soup and heated them on a camp stove he'd had in the back of the truck for 2 years. Lily ate and read. Vivian sat across from Ethan with her hands wrapped around the cup and told him about her father. Richard Blackwood had founded Blackwood Aerospace in 1989 with 2 engineers, a lease on a Reno machine shop, and a contract to supply precision machined components to a commercial aviation supplier. He'd spent 15 years building the company into a mid-tier supplier with clients throughout the commercial and private aviation sector. He'd been, by Vivian's account, demanding, exacting, occasionally impossible, and devoted to the work, to the company, and to Vivian, who was his only child after her mother's death in 1995. He was a systems person, Vivian said. He didn't see machines, he saw processes, Every component in relation to every other component, everything in sequence, everything load-bearing and interdependent. She drank her soup. He used to say that the most dangerous thing in engineering wasn't ignorance. It was confidence without data. What do you think happened? Ethan asked. She looked at him steadily. I thought it was an accident. For 17 years, that's what I thought. There was a crash investigation, NTSB, standard process, and the findings indicated mechanical failure, rotor system anomaly. It was, she paused, unsatisfying as findings go. The anomaly wasn't well explained. The wreckage was largely destroyed on impact and fire, but accidents are sometimes unsatisfying. I accepted it. And now? She looked back at the hangar. Now I'm looking at a helicopter that I personally identified as destroyed in the crash that killed my father, sitting perfectly intact in a desert hangar on a piece of property my family once owned. She said it evenly. But her jaw was set in a way that made Ethan think the evenness cost something. Which means, she said, either I was wrong about the wreckage, or the wreckage I identified was not this helicopter. If it wasn't this helicopter, Ethan said carefully, then what burned in that field? Vivian looked at him, and in her eyes, beneath the composure and the control, was the answer she hadn't said yet, the thing she'd been not saying since the moment she walked into the hangar and saw the scratch on the door frame. Another aircraft, she said, substituted before the crash. She paused. Which would mean the crash was not an accident. Another pause. Which would mean my father's death was not an accident. The desert had gone dark while they were talking. The stars over Nevada in late summer were extraordinarily dense, the Milky Way a visible smear across the black, and the temperature had finally dropped below 90. Somewhere across the airfield, something moved through the creosote brush. A small animal, gone before Ethan could see it. Lily had put her book down. She was looking at Vivian with the straightforward, unmanaged attention of someone who doesn't know yet to look away from difficult things. Who would do that? Lily asked. Vivian looked at her, and Ethan saw something shift, the slight give in the controlled exterior, the thing underneath. That's the question I've been afraid to ask for 17 years, Vivian said. It was honest. It was more honest than Ethan had expected from someone who moved in the world the way she did. And maybe that was why he said what he said next, even though he was aware of how absurd it sounded from a man who'd arrived here 2 days ago with $43 in his pocket and a daughter in the back seat. Then let's find the answer, he said. Vivian looked at him. She didn't immediately agree or dismiss it. She assessed it, the way she probably assessed everything, for structural integrity. You understand what you're suggesting, she said. Probably not the full extent of it, he admitted. But you came here for a reason. You drove out to an abandoned desert airfield to look at a helicopter that shouldn't exist. You didn't have to tell me any of what you just told me. You could have come in here, looked around, and offered me a number to make this go away. She held his gaze. What's stopping you? He said. A long pause. The desert wind moved through the open hangar door behind them. The fluorescent lights, visible through the gap, buzzed their low electrical hum. I tried to make things go away for a long time, Vivian Blackwood said. It didn't work. It just went away on its terms instead of mine. Ethan nodded. He understood that. Thursday, he said. An appraiser is coming to document the vehicles. After that, he stopped, reorganized. After that, I think we need to start looking at those logs. The maintenance logs, registration documents, anything in this building with paper attached. There might be more than that, Vivian said slowly. My father was methodical. If he kept aircraft here, if this was some kind of... She trailed off, working through it. If this was deliberate, if he brought these vehicles here intentionally, preserved them here, then he would have documented it. Everything. He documented everything. So we look, Ethan said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll have a forensic aviation engineer I trust here by Friday. Okay. Her name is Dr. Helena Cross. She's the best at what she does. Okay. Vivian looked at him again with that evaluating structural integrity look. Mr. Mercer, Ethan. A slight pause, as if she were testing the informality, deciding if it fit. You bought an abandoned piece of desert on an impulse and found the most consequential collection of evidence in my family's history. What made you bid on this property? He thought about it. The honest answer was that he'd been out of options, nearly out of money, and desperate enough to take a risk that no one with better choices would have taken. He'd been looking at government auction sites for commercial property he could afford, and this one had come up with comically low reserve, so low it had been listed twice, because the first auction had closed without a single bid. No one wanted an abandoned desert airfield, except a man who had no other door to walk through. I needed something to try, he said. It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't the kind of answer that became a story, but Vivian nodded as if she understood the full weight of it. He lay in the truck that night, Lily asleep in the back, the desert quiet except for the occasional small animal sounds and the faint tick of the cooling engine. He thought about the scratch on the doorframe, the crescent shape of a barrette caught on paint, 17 years sealed inside a locked hangar, waiting for the woman who made it to come back. He thought about what someone would have to do, what they would have to plan, coordinate, execute, to swap one helicopter for another before a crash. The logistics of it, the lead time, the people who'd have to be involved and trusted and paid, the reason someone would do it. He thought about Richard Blackwood, systems man, confidence without data man, who had apparently assembled 9 supercars and 3 helicopters in a locked Nevada hangar and locked the door and left them there. Evidence, Vivian had said. A carefully assembled archive. Of what? Of something he'd found, something he'd been building a case for, something he hadn't lived to present. Ethan lay there in the Nevada dark with all of it turning over in his mind, and he thought about his daughter sleeping 6 feet away and his $43 wallet and the deed in his jacket pocket. He hadn't known what he was buying, that was true, but he was starting to understand what he'd walked into. And somewhere between the thought and the sleep that finally came for him, he made the decision that would reshape the next year of his life. He was going to see this through, not for the money, though God knew he needed the money, not for Vivian Blackwood and her grief, though that was real and it moved him more than he'd expected. He was going to see this through because something about an abandoned hangar full of locked-up truth felt familiar to him. He'd spent the last 3 years locked up in a version of his own wreckage, convinced that what he'd lost was all there was to him. Sometimes the locked door leads somewhere worth opening. He closed his eyes. The desert held its breath. And somewhere across the dark airfield, under a dying fluorescent light, the silver helicopter sat in its painted lines and kept its long silence, just a little longer. Dave Gutierrez arrived Thursday morning in a white cargo van with a magnetic sign on the door that said Southwest Collector Vehicle Services and a passenger seat buried under manila folders, a camera bag, and what appeared to be an entire filing system built from binder clips and rubber bands. He was a short man in his late 50s with the particular kind of tan you get from decades of working in and around open desert, deep and permanent, more leather than skin. And he shook Ethan's hand with both of his, which was either warmth or the reflex of a man who'd spent his career making sellers feel comfortable before delivering bad news. He stopped in the entrance to the hangar the same way Vivian had stopped. Different reason, same effect. Well, Dave said. Yeah, Ethan said. Dave walked to the nearest car, the Lamborghini, and crouched beside it without touching it, looking at the wheel wells, the door seam, the way the light caught the paint. He made a low sound. Then he moved to the Bugatti, then the McLaren, spending about 90 seconds on each before moving to the next. Ethan followed at a respectful distance and said nothing, because he'd worked with assessors enough to know that they were not actually examining the cars yet. They were calibrating, getting a feel for the room. Finally, Dave straightened up and turned to Ethan. Okay, he said. I need you to understand something before we go any further. All right. What you have in this building... He stopped, scratched the back of his neck. I've been doing this for 31 years. I've worked estate sales, insurance liquidations, bankruptcy auctions, private collections. I've seen some things. He gestured at the room. I have not seen this. What's the value? I can't give you an accurate number without running the VINs and doing full inspection, which will take me 2 days minimum, but rough, preliminary, with the caveat that the McLaren alone, he exhaled. That's a $7 million car. The Bugatti Veyron in this condition, unregistered, with what looks like original everything. I'd have to make calls. But you're looking at somewhere between 4 and 6 million, depending on documentation. The Ferrari Enzo, the Maserati MC12. He shook his head. The entire room, conservatively, if these vehicles are what they appear to be and the provenance checks out, you're talking north of $30 million. The number landed in the hot hangar air and just sat there. Ethan had done rough math in his head. He'd come up with similar figures. Hearing them said out loud by someone with 31 years of experience was a different thing entirely. I need a minute, Ethan said. Take your time, Dave said. He was already uncapping a lens on his camera. Ethan walked outside and stood in the sun and called his attorney in Reno. The attorney listened without interrupting, which was a professional courtesy that probably cost $250 per hour and was worth every cent. The contents therein language in your deed, the attorney said when Ethan finished, is about as clean as it gets. You purchased the property and its contents, full stop. If any of these vehicles carry clear title, meaning they're not listed as stolen in any database, they're yours. And if some of them are listed as stolen, then you'd be required to surrender those specific vehicles to the relevant claimant, but you'd retain ownership of the others, and depending on the circumstances, you might have recovery rights against whoever sold the property with stolen goods inside it. A pause. Run the VINs before you do anything else. Any vehicle not flagged in a theft database is yours clean. And if someone just shows up and says they own them, without documentation, they have no claim. This isn't a finder's keeper situation legally. You have a deed. They'd need to show standing in court. Another pause. You're not expecting someone to show up and say that, are you? Ethan thought about Vivian Blackwood, who was at that moment presumably driving back from wherever she'd spent the night because she'd left after dark and said she'd be back Friday with Dr. Helena Cross. Not exactly, he said. He hung up and went back inside. Lily was helping Dave photograph VIN plates. Ethan watched them for a moment. The appraiser talking, pointing, explaining what he was looking for. His daughter listening with her head slightly tilted, asking questions in her flat, precise way. She'd gone to sleep last night quiet and had woken up quiet, in the manner she had of processing things internally and only presenting conclusions when they were formed. She hadn't asked more about Vivian or the helicopter or what Ethan intended to do next. She'd just gotten up and made herself useful. He thought about school enrollment. He hadn't figured that out yet. The nearest town of any size was 40 miles east. He had enough money to last maybe 6 weeks at a motel, less if they ate real meals. The property had no utilities beyond what the county line had left dormant. There was a water connection that could theoretically be reactivated but wasn't currently, and no power except the old generator circuit in the hangar. $30 million. North of $30 million, David said. Conservatively. The word conservatively had never felt so specific. He let himself hold the number for exactly long enough to understand why he couldn't trust it yet. Because it wasn't real, not yet. Not until the VINs cleared and the appraisals finalized and the legal questions answered themselves. Getting ahead of that would be the easiest way to make a catastrophic mistake. He'd seen men do it. He'd done it himself once, in a different context, with different stakes, and the consequences of that particular optimism had taken 4 years of his life. So he filed the number in the part of his mind marked, "Do not spend yet," and went to help photograph cars. Dave stayed 2 days, methodically working through each vehicle with a thoroughness that occasionally crossed into reverence. He ran every VIN through multiple databases, NCIC, NICB, International Theft Registries, and reported results to Ethan each evening with the careful precision of a man who understood what was riding on each entry. Every vehicle came back clean, not flagged, not reported stolen, not attached to any open investigation or insurance claim. It was, Dave said on the evening of the second day, one of the more remarkable findings of his career, because a collection of this profile, assembled in this way, should have generated at least one hit somewhere. The absence of flags wasn't just good news. It was almost its own kind of data. Whoever put these here, Dave said, either acquired them through private channels with documentation so clean it never triggered a report, or they had the resources to make sure no reports existed, Ethan said. Dave nodded. I'm going to say something I don't normally say to a client because I think you need to hear it. He capped his pen. Be careful, Mr. Mercer. Collections like this don't accumulate by accident. They have histories. And the histories have people attached to them. He paused. Not all of those people are going to be happy about you poking around. It was the second warning of this kind Ethan had received in 5 days. He was starting to think they were worth paying attention to. Dave left Friday morning. By noon, Vivian Blackwood's Escalade was back at the gate, and behind it a silver Jeep Wagoneer that parked alongside it with the decisive "this is where I stop" certainty of someone who'd made the drive before. Dr. Helena Cross got out of the Jeep, and Ethan revised his mental picture of what a forensic aviation engineer looked like. He'd been imagining someone in her 60s, slight, academic. The woman who walked toward him was maybe 50, tall, with wide shoulders and the deliberate, measured movement of someone who'd spent decades crawling around aircraft structures in tight spaces. She wore cargo pants and a plain gray shirt and carried a canvas equipment bag over one shoulder that looked like it weighed about 40 pounds and didn't seem to bother her. She shook Ethan's hand with a firm, brief grip. "Dr. Cross," he said, "Helena's fine." She looked past him at the hangar. "Vivian says you have a Bell 429 that shouldn't exist." "That's one way to put it." "Then let's go look at it." Helena Cross went to work the way surgeons go to work, with a kind of focused quietness that excluded everything unnecessary. She circled the silver helicopter twice without touching it, looking at angles and surfaces and seam lines before she put on a pair of nitrile gloves and began her examination. She opened an access panel along the engine cowling. She checked the tail rotor assembly with a small flashlight, her head tilted in the cramped space, working from memory of what should be where. She ran her fingers along the skid frame and turned them over and looked at what the dust had deposited. Vivian stood back and watched, her arms crossed, her expression controlled. Ethan stood near the entrance with Lily, staying out of the way. After 40 minutes of silence, Helena Cross straightened up. "Right," she said. She pulled off one glove and fished in her bag for a notebook. "The serial number on the airframe plate is intact and legible. I'll need to cross-reference it, but I can already tell you there are component serial numbers on the transmission housing and the main rotor mass that don't match the plate number." She flipped a page. In aviation, that typically indicates one of two things. Either the aircraft was rebuilt with components from another aircraft at some point, which happens legitimately in maintenance, though it generates a paper trail, or the airframe and components were deliberately mixed to obscure the aircraft's identity. "Which do you think it is?" Vivian asked. Helena looked at her with the measured, diagnostic expression of someone who doesn't trade in comfort. "I think it's the second, but I need documentation to prove the first didn't happen." She looked back at her notebook. "The rotor mass serial number I found, I've seen it before. I worked a crash investigation in 2007. Nevada desert rotor failure. The air in the hangar did something, not dramatically. It just changed weight." Vivian's arms dropped from their crossed position to her sides. "The Blackwood crash," Vivian said. It wasn't a question. "I was a junior investigator. It was one of my first major cases." Helena's voice was even and professional and very careful. "The mass serial number I just photographed, I'd have to pull my original notes to confirm, and I intend to, but I believe it matches the serial I recorded from the wreckage in 2007. Vivian walked forward until she was standing beside Helena, both of them looking at the aircraft. "So the rotor mass from the helicopter that crashed is inside this helicopter. That's what the numbers suggest. Which means this airframe and the crashed airframe shared components. Whether that's because this helicopter was rebuilt using crash salvage, or because someone put components from this helicopter into a different aircraft before the crash." She paused. "I can't tell you that yet without more analysis, but I can tell you the component histories don't add up." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Lily said from behind Ethan, "So someone might have moved parts around, between this helicopter and another one, before the crash." Helena Cross turned and looked at her. "That's a coherent possibility." "Why would someone do that?" "To make the aircraft that crashed look like this aircraft," Helena said. "If you want investigators to think a specific helicopter burned, but you want to preserve the actual helicopter, you'd need the wreckage to carry enough identifying markers. Serial numbers on major components." She paused. It's not a simple operation, but it's technically feasible. Lily nodded once, processing this, and went back to her book. Ethan loved her for that, for the way she asked the direct question, received the direct answer, and didn't need to make it into a performance. Vivian turned away from the helicopter and walked toward the workbench along the south wall, where Ethan had been organizing the materials he'd found in the hangar's small attached office space. A cluttered 8x10 room behind the east wall accessed through the personnel door, which he'd gotten open with a borrowed drill and a replacement key blank from a locksmith in Ridgecrest. The office had yielded paper, a lot of it. Maintenance logs, aircraft maintenance records, handwritten notes in a cramped, angular script, a series of numbered folders in a filing cabinet that had been locked, but not particularly seriously locked. The kind of lock you put on something not to stop a determined person, but to slow down a casual one. Ethan had laid everything out on the workbench in approximate chronological order. He hadn't read most of it carefully yet. He'd been waiting for Vivian, partly because some of it was clearly personal, and he'd felt the boundary there, and partly because she would know what she was looking at better than he did. She stopped in front of the workbench and stood very still. "That's his handwriting," she said. Ethan said nothing. She picked up the top folder, opened it, read the first page without moving for a while. Then she set it down and picked up the second, and by the time she'd been through the third, her breathing had changed. Slightly faster, slightly tighter, the body doing what the face wasn't. "He knew," she said. "About what?" Ethan asked. She set the folder down and turned to face him. "He found something in the supply chain." Her voice had the compressed, too careful quality of someone reciting words that don't feel real yet. He was auditing component suppliers. He did that himself, personally. He didn't delegate that kind of quality work. And he found a discrepancy. A supplier called Harmon Colt Fabrication. They were providing rotor system components to multiple aircraft manufacturers, including Blackwood's commercial supply clients. What was the discrepancy? The certification documentation said the alloy composition on the rotor head components met spec, but the metallurgical tests he commissioned, she tapped the folder. In-house tests. He ran them quietly, didn't report them yet. The actual composition was off. Meaningfully off. Not enough to fail in most conditions, but under specific stress loads, high altitude, prolonged operation, high vibration environments. She paused. They could fail. Catastrophically. Helena had come to stand beside Vivian, reading over her shoulder with the attentiveness of someone recognizing the language of her own field. "Rotor head failure in flight," Helena said. "That's fatal," Vivian said, "in almost every configuration." The words sat in the room. Ethan looked at the maintenance logs spread across the workbench, the folders, the handwritten notes in Richard Blackwood's cramped, angular script. A man who trusted his own hands for the most important things, who documented everything, who understood that the most dangerous thing in engineering was confidence without data. A man who had found data that terrified him. "He was building a case," Ethan said. "He was building a case," Vivian confirmed. "These logs, the test results, the supplier documentation. He was assembling it. He needed enough to go to regulators without it being dismissed or buried." She picked up another folder, and this one she opened more slowly. Her expression, when she read what was inside, changed. "What?" Ethan asked. She didn't answer immediately. She finished reading the page, then read it again. "There's a name," she said. He waited. "Victor Blackwood," she said. "My uncle." The name came out of her flat and clean, the way you say a name when you've been afraid of saying it for a long time, and you've finally decided to stop being afraid. "Internal approval records," she continued, her voice steady now in the particular way that steadiness is a decision rather than a feeling. "Purchase approvals for Harmon Colt components, going back 5 years before my father's death. Victor was VP of supply chain operations at the time." She set the folder down carefully. "These notes indicate my father believed Victor knew about the alloy discrepancy before he ordered the components, and that Victor approved the orders anyway." The fluorescent lights hummed. Outside, the desert wind moved across the airfield, rattling the fence line. Helena Cross spoke carefully. "That's an allegation with significant implications." "Yes," Vivian said. I know. If your father was assembling this to present to federal regulators, and if Victor knew he was building a case, then Victor had reason to stop him, Vivian said. Before he could. She said it like she'd been carrying it for years without knowing what it weighed, and now that it was out in the air, it was heavier than she'd expected. She put both hands on the workbench and stood there for a moment looking at the spread of her father's documents, 17 years old, still speaking. I need to make a call, she said. She walked out through the rolling door into the afternoon heat and took out her phone. Ethan watched her go, then looked at Helena. What do you need from me? He asked. Helena thought about it. Time. Access. I want to pull every maintenance log in this building and cross-reference against the NTSB records from the 2007 investigation. I have contacts at the board. Not everyone, but people I trust. She paused. What I want to know is whether the investigative record matches what's in these logs, or whether there are gaps, discrepancies, things that were in the crash investigation file that don't appear here, or vice versa. How long does that take? Depends what I find. She looked at the helicopter. A week. Maybe less if the components tell me what I think they're going to tell me. Ethan nodded. Helena looked at him with a directness that reminded him of Lily, in the sense that she appeared to say exactly what she meant. Mr. Mercer, you understand that what's in these files, if it's what Vivian thinks it is, this isn't a local story. This is a federal case. Aviation safety, corporate fraud, and potentially something worse. She paused. People have already worked very hard for 17 years to make sure none of this came out. I'm starting to understand that, he said. Good. She picked up her equipment bag. Then act like it. She went back to the helicopter and Ethan went outside where Vivian was finishing her call. She was standing with her back to him, one hand in her jacket pocket, the other holding her phone. When she heard him approach, she turned, and her face had settled into something resolved and exhausted at the same time. I called my board secretary, she said. There's going to be a board meeting in 2 weeks, regularly scheduled. Victor will be there. He's been on the board since my father died. He was the one who... She stopped, started again. After the crash, during the estate proceedings, Victor managed most of the transition. He was the one who filed the paperwork to dissolve Blackwood Aerospace's aviation division. He was the one who recommended we shift the company toward tech manufacturing. She looked at Ethan steadily. He was in a very advantageous position to make sure certain things got buried. Did you ever suspect him? Before now? She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. I suspected the investigation was insufficient, she said. The NTSB finding, rotor system anomaly, it was too vague, but I was 26 years old and I'd just lost my father, and Victor was the person helping me hold the company together, and... She stopped. You trust the people who show up after. You don't have the bandwidth to question them. Ethan understood that. He'd trusted people who showed up after. Some of them had deserved it. One of them, his former business partner, absolutely had not. He's going to find out you're here, Ethan said. If he has people monitoring property records the way you do, he already might know. I've thought about that. She looked out at the airfield. The afternoon light was going gold and long across the runway, the kind of light the Nevada desert specialized in. Beautiful and indifferent. He'll approach it legally first. That's his way. He'll try to establish that the collection is corporate property, that the contents therein language doesn't cover assets of this nature. Something. He'll hire attorneys. My attorney says the deed language is clean. Your attorney hasn't met Victor's attorneys. She said it without heat, just fact. But it doesn't matter. We're not going to be in a position to defend the property legally unless we've already built the factual case. The documents here, Helena's component analysis, cross-referenced against the investigation records. She paused. We need to move faster than Victor does. We need to understand what's in every folder in that office, Ethan said. Yes. And Helena needs time with the helicopter. Yes. Then I think you should be here, not in a hotel 40 miles away. Here. She looked at him. There's no... He gestured vaguely at the property. There's no accommodation. There's the truck. and a camp set up. "I've slept in worse conditions," she said, which he doubted but appreciated. "I can get a generator going by tonight. There's a water line I need to call the county about." He thought about the list. "I'll make it work." She nodded, then unexpectedly, "Why are you doing this?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, you have a potentially clean deed to $30-odd million in collector vehicles. You could document the collection, fight any legal challenges from a position of ownership, sell the assets, and walk away comfortable for life. What you're describing, what we're doing, is substantially more complicated than that, and substantially more dangerous." She held his gaze. "Why does it matter to you? My father was not your father." Ethan looked at the airfield, at the cracked runway and the tilted fence and the sun going long and golden across all of it. He thought about the right answer, the one that sounded good. Then he set that aside and found the honest one. "Because I know what it feels like when a story that matters gets buried," he said. "Not on this scale. My scale is considerably smaller, but the feeling of someone deciding what's true and everyone else just living inside their version of it." He stopped. "Your father built something in that office. He documented it. He put these vehicles here like he was making sure there was something left, in case he didn't make it." Ethan paused. "That deserves better than being sold off as real estate inventory." Vivian was quiet. Then, "He would have liked you," she said. "He had no tolerance for people who did things for the easy reason." They stood there for a moment in the late afternoon light, the airfield stretching out before them and the hangar behind them, and somewhere inside, Helena Cross and the silver helicopter engaged in their slow, careful conversation of disassembly and discovery. The problem was that Ethan had not yet told Vivian what he'd found in the back of the filing cabinet. He'd found it the previous afternoon while sorting folders, not in the main cabinet, but in a secondary drawer behind it, shallower, painted the same gray, easy to overlook. Inside was a single expandable folder, thicker than the others, sealed with a red elastic band that had gone brittle with age and snapped when he'd stretched it. Inside the folder were two things: a handwritten letter, several pages, in the same cramped angular script as the maintenance notes, and a sealed envelope with a single name written on the front. Vivian. He'd put it aside. He'd been sitting with the question of when to give it to her, and how, and whether there was a right moment for something like that. There probably wasn't. There never was. He went back inside and crossed the hangar to where he'd laid the expandable folder on the workbench apart from the other materials. He picked it up. He walked back out into the light. "There's something I found yesterday," he said. "I've been trying to find the right time." She looked at him, looked at the folder. He held it out. She took it, felt the weight of it, unfolded the top. She saw the envelope, her name, her father's handwriting. The composed executive face didn't shatter, it didn't crack. What happened was quieter than that, a kind of internal shift, visible in the way her hands changed their grip on the folder, the way she breathed once, slowly, through her nose. "Where was this?" she asked. Second drawer behind the main cabinet. It was easy to miss. She looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then she tucked the folder under her arm and walked away from him. Not far, just to the edge of the concrete pad where the airfield began. She stood with her back to him, in the long late light, and she opened the envelope. Ethan went inside. He let her have it. He found Lily helping Helena document component numbers, holding a flashlight at the angle Helena directed while Helena photographed each numbered surface with her camera. They developed an efficient working rhythm. Helena asking for light adjustments with brief, precise instructions, Lily adjusting without confirmation, both of them operating in the concentrated quiet of people who don't need to talk to coordinate. He stood and watched them for a while, and he thought about the letter Vivian was reading behind him, and he thought about Richard Blackwood sitting in this same room 17 years ago, writing a letter he couldn't deliver, preserving evidence he couldn't present, locking a door he hoped someone would eventually open. It took Vivian about 30 minutes. When she came back inside, her eyes were dry, but her face had that quality of recent weather. Not the storm itself, but the air after. She put the folder on the workbench. She smoothed the cover flat with one hand. He knew they were going to come for him, she said. He'd found a surveillance device in his office at the company. He'd started finding inconsistencies in documents he'd signed, alterations made after his signature. He'd requested meetings with 2 regulatory contacts he trusted, and both of them had canceled at the last minute. She paused. He wrote this about 3 weeks before the crash. He thought he had another month to finalize the documentation and file the formal complaint. Her jaw was set, but her voice was level. He didn't. Nobody spoke. He says in the letter that he assembled this collection deliberately, she continued, not just the aircraft, the vehicles as well. Several of the cars contain additional documentation, hidden. He didn't specify where or how because he was afraid the letter would be intercepted. She looked around the hangar. He trusted that whoever found this place would look carefully enough. She paused. Or that I would. Ethan looked at the 9 dust-clothed cars, 3 rows of 3, the evidence that Richard Blackwood had believed would survive him. Hidden documents inside vehicles that no one would think to look inside, in a locked hangar on a piece of desert property that no one had bid on in 5 years. We need to look inside every car, Helena said from across the room. She'd lowered her camera, and her voice had that careful, professional evenness she seemed to deploy when things got significant. All of them, seat panels, door cards, floor structures, whatever he hid, he built it in to stay found. Tomorrow, Vivian said. We start tomorrow. She said it without drama, without the weight of announcement, like a decision made and recorded and done. She sat down in one of the camp chairs and picked up the letter again and read it a second time. Whether that was for the information or for something else, Ethan didn't ask. Lily materialized beside him with the quiet efficiency she had for appearing at moments when he needed her without being called. What do we do for dinner? She asked. Soup, I think. Okay. She looked at Vivian, then back at Ethan. Should I make enough for 3? Yeah, he said. Make enough for 4. Helena, too. Lily nodded and went to the camp stove, and Ethan stood at the edge of the light watching the desert go dark again, the way it did every night, total and absolute, the stars arriving in their thousands. And he thought that somewhere in the bones of the 9 cars across this concrete floor, a dead man was still trying to speak. They were going to have to do the listening. The Lamborghini was first, not because they had a system yet, they were still figuring out the system, but because it was nearest to the door and Ethan had learned early in his mechanic years that you start with what's in front of you and build the method as you go. He and Vivian pulled the dust cloth off together in the morning light, the canvas coming away in a slow billow that caught the fluorescent glare and then settled to the floor. The black paint underneath was still extraordinary, deep and liquid, almost architectural in the way it held light. Helena was back at the helicopter. She'd been up before any of them, and when Ethan had emerged from the truck at 6, she was already inside the hangar with her equipment bag open and her flashlight running, working in the silence the way she did everything, methodically, without announcement. She'd said good morning by raising 2 fingers without looking up, which Ethan had come to understand as her version of warmth. Lily was at the folding table with her breakfast and a legal pad, self-assigned to documentation. She'd decided the previous evening that someone needed to record everything they found and where they found it in a format that could be presented externally, which was a more legally coherent instinct than most adults in Ethan's experience would have had. Tell me what you find and I'll write it down, she'd told them. You need a chain of custody. Vivian had looked at her with the focused, assessing attention she normally reserved for adults. Where did you learn about chain of custody? I read a lot, Lily said. So Ethan and Vivian worked the first car together, starting with the interior. The Lamborghini's cabin was remarkably preserved. Leather dry but not cracked, no animal damage, instruments dusty but intact. They pulled the seat squabs, checked beneath the carpeting, ran their hands along the door panels, feeling for anything that didn't belong. Door cards in a production vehicle had a particular density and flex, while you could feel the difference between factory spec and something added behind the panel, the way you can feel a lump under a mattress. 20 minutes in, Vivian pressed the inside of the driver's door card and stopped. Here, she said. Ethan came around to her side. She pressed the card again, the lower third toward the rear, and there was a faint sound. Not the hollow tap of air cavity, something denser. He got the trim tool from the workbench and worked the card edge carefully. It came away from the doorframe with the resistance of something that had been re-adhered, The factory clips had been supplemented with additional adhesive, applied with some care, flush enough that a casual inspection wouldn't catch it. Behind the panel, between the card and the door's inner structure, was a flat package, a large manila envelope folded once, wrapped in what appeared to be a heat-sealed plastic sleeve of the kind used to protect documents from moisture. He handed it to Vivian. She didn't open it immediately. She turned it over in her hands, looking at it, reading the handwriting on the front. Her father's script. A date, March 2007, 4 months before the crash. "Lily," she said. Lily came over with her legal pad. "Lamborghini, driver's door card, lower third panel," she said, already writing. "Envelope, sealed, dated March 2007. She looked up. "Anything else?" "Not yet," Vivian said. They opened it at this folding table, spreading the contents flat. It was a set of photocopied documents, purchase orders, supplier certification forms, internal sign-off sheets, each one carrying a header Ethan didn't recognize, but Vivian did. "Harmon Colt Fabrication," she said, and Blackwood Aerospace internal routing forms. She scanned the pages, moving through them with increasing speed, the way you read faster when the words are confirming something you suspected. "These are the component orders. 5 years of rotor head orders routed through Harmon Colt, each one signed off through the supply chain division." She reached the last page and held it up. "Every approval signature here is Victor's." She set it down. Her face was controlled, but her hands weren't quite. A slight tension in the fingers. A grip held slightly too firm on the edge of the page. "Okay," Ethan said. "That's one." It took them 4 days to go through all 9 cars. Not because each car took a day. Some of them yielded their hidden materials in under an hour, once they understood Richard Blackwood's method. He had a system. He'd use the same type of re-adhered panel concealment in each vehicle, always in a location that required intent to find but not destruction to access. Door cards, floor panels, the underside of fixed seat structures. One car, the Maserati, had a package beneath the headliner above the rear passenger seat, which Lily found because she was the only one small enough to comfortably lie across the back seat and look straight up. "Got one," she said, and Ethan heard the satisfaction in her voice that she didn't bother to conceal when she'd done something correct. What made it 4 days was everything else. The reading, the cross-referencing, the conversations between Vivian and Helena that ran long into each evening as they mapped what the documents said against what the physical evidence on the helicopter confirmed, against what the NTSB investigation records said, against what was missing from each. Helena had a contact at the NTSB, a woman named Diane Kessler, retired 3 years ago, who'd been a senior investigator for 20 years before that. Helena called her on the second day and spoke to her for an hour, not sharing details but asking about the 2007 Blackwood investigation, who'd led it, what the final report cited, what the physical evidence log had contained. She came back from the call with her notebook in hand and an expression that Ethan was starting to learn, a contained professional tightness that meant she'd found something she hadn't been looking for. "The lead investigator on the Blackwood crash was a man named Carroll," she said. "Gerald Carroll. He retired about a year after the case closed." She flipped a page. Diane said the investigation moved unusually fast, 4 months from crash to final report, which for a fatal accident with disputed components is on the short end. She also said there were 2 investigators who filed minority opinions within the team, not formal dissents, informal objections, which means they're in the working files but not in the public record. She paused. Both of them left the NTSB within 6 months of the report. "Left voluntarily?" Ethan asked. Diane said she always assumed so. She's reconsidering. Vivian was across the room looking at a set of documents she'd spread across the hood of the Ferrari. She didn't look up. "Where's Gerald Carroll now?" "Diane doesn't know. She lost track of him. He retired to somewhere in Arizona is all she had." Helena paused. She said his lifestyle post-retirement looked more comfortable than a federal pension typically supports. She remembers thinking that at the time and telling herself it was none of her business. Vivian set down the document she was holding. "Someone paid him." "That's the inference," Helena said carefully. "I can't prove it yet." "No," Vivian agreed, "but my father can." She picked up the document again and brought it across to Helena. It was a bank routing record, not official, but clearly a copy of something that had originated in an official system. Handwritten annotations in the margins identified the routing numbers. A note at the bottom, in Richard's angular script, read, "Confirm origin, HC operational account, cross-ref Carol retainer." Helena read it, then read it again. "Your father identified a payment," she said. "He suspected one. He had the routing number. He didn't have time to complete the verification." Vivian set the page down. "We need a forensic accountant." Ethan was quiet for a moment. The math of this was expanding in ways he found hard to contain. What had begun as a property deed and an unexpected inventory had grown into something with federal investigators and retirement accounts and payment trails that went back 17 years. He had a lawyer in Reno who handled commercial real estate. He was going to need a different kind of lawyer now. "I know someone," Vivian said, which was how she said most things when a resource was needed. Not, "I'll find someone." She always already knew someone. It was both an asset and occasionally a slight reminder of the distance between their respective positions in the world. She caught his expression and paused. "What?" "Nothing." "No." "What?" He looked at her. "I keep thinking about the scale of this. The money that went into burying it. Carol, whoever else was involved, the documentation trail. This took resources. It took people." He paused. "Victor's been running your company for 17 years. He had access to those resources." "I know." "And he knows what's in these cars, or he suspects." "Probably." "Then why hasn't he moved on the property? Why hasn't he shown up with lawyers the way you said he would?" Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because he doesn't know about the cars. He knows about the hangar. It's in the dissolution paperwork he filed, listed as a non-essential property associated with the defunct aviation division. He probably assumed it was empty, or if not empty, that it contained aircraft maintenance equipment, maybe the helicopters." She paused. "He wouldn't have imagined my father had the foresight to do this. Victor never understood my father. He thought he was impractical, too rigorous about things that didn't generate revenue." "He's going to find out," Ethan said. "Yes. When the board meeting happens, someone will mention the property sale. Someone always mentions property sales at board meetings." She looked at the spread of documents. "We have maybe 10 days. Then we need to be done in 10 days. She looked at him with that structural integrity look. "That's not a lot of time," she said. "No," Ethan agreed. "Let's stop standing here talking about it." It wasn't eloquent, but she nodded and went back to the Ferrari, and Ethan went to help Helena with the McLaren. The McLaren F1 was the car that changed everything. Not because of what was hidden inside it, though that was significant, but because of what was written on the underside of the driver's seat base, in permanent marker, in handwriting that was neither Richard Blackwood's nor anyone they'd identified yet. Ethan found it while he was on his back with a flashlight, working the seat frame bolts. He almost missed it. The writing was on the inward face of the frame rail, angled away from direct view, which meant it was written by someone who wanted it findable, but not accidentally found. He angled the light. "N. Hargrove, HCQC, kept my copy." "R knows." He stared at it. Then he photographed it with his phone, called Vivian over without standing up, and watched her lie down beside him on the concrete, suit jacket and all, without any particular hesitation, to look at the writing herself. She was quiet for 10 seconds. "N. Hargrove," she said, "Harmon Colt Quality Control." "Someone inside the supplier," Ethan said. "A whistleblower. Or someone who intended to be." She looked at the message. "Kept my copy. R knows." "My father had a contact inside Harmon Colt, someone who confirmed the alloy discrepancy from the inside." She paused. "Someone who had their own documentation. Someone who might still be alive." She was quiet. "Vivian," he said. "I heard you." She sat up, dust on her jacket. She didn't brush it off. "N. Hargrove. Quality Control. Harmon Colt Fabrication." She thought about it. Harmon Colt went through a significant restructuring in 2010. The aviation components division was sold off to a defense contractor, Most of their QC staff either transferred or were let go. She stood up. If someone named Hargrove was in that division in 2007, finding them now is difficult, Ethan said. Not impossible. How would you find them? He thought about it. I'd start with the Nevada Business Registry for Harmon Colt's old address, cross-reference with any public employment records, LinkedIn if they have a profile, professional licensing if they held any kind of materials testing certification. Those have public registries, he paused. Or your forensic accountant might find them faster through financial records. Vivian looked at him. You've thought about this before, she said. Finding people who don't want to be found. Finding a former business partner who'd moved assets before dissolving our partnership, Ethan said. Yeah, different context, same basic problem. He stood up and brushed concrete dust off the back of his shirt. She was still looking at him in that evaluating way she had, and he was starting to understand that it wasn't coldness. It was how she paid attention, which was thoroughly and without the social softening most people applied to direct eye contact. Did you find him? She asked. Eventually. He paused. Didn't matter by then. The assets were gone. She absorbed this. I'm sorry. It's what brought me here, he said. So, he picked up his flashlight and went back to work. The documents from the McLaren were in the seat base itself. A flat folder tucked into a custom-cut space in the foam, so precise in its fit that it looked factory if you didn't know to look for it. Inside, metallurgical test reports. Not Richard Blackwood's own tests. These were on Harmon Colt letterhead. Internal QC reports, dated between 2004 and 2006, each one showing alloy composition results for rotor head components. Each one showing the discrepancy, and each one carrying a handwritten note in the margin. Reviewed, cleared for shipping. VB. The initials. Not a signature, just initials. 2 letters and a period. Vivian held the pages and didn't speak for almost a full minute. He approved them, she said. Not a question. He looked at these results, he saw the numbers, and he signed off. Helena had come to stand behind her, reading over her shoulder. Those initials alone won't hold up as definitive identification in court, but in combination with the purchase approvals we found in the Lamborghini, the routing records, and whatever Hargrove has, she paused. It's a pattern. Patterns are what prosecutions are built on. He knew the parts were defective, Vivian said. Her voice was level in the way that levelness is a dam, not a river. He knew they would be used in aircraft. He signed off anyway. She set the pages down. How many aircraft were affected? I'd need the full shipping records from Harmon Colt, Helena said. But given the volume of orders and the purchase approvals, the components went to at least 4 commercial operators and 2 private aviation clients over a period of 3 years. She paused. Some of those components are almost certainly still in service on aircraft that fly every day. The weight of that settled into the room. It was Lily who said the thing nobody else had said yet, quietly from the table where she'd been recording notes. People could die, she said. Not dramatically, just precisely. Yes, Helena said, or could have, depending on the stress loads those aircraft have operated under. She looked at Vivian. This isn't just about your father anymore. This is an active safety issue. I know, Vivian said. Knowing and acting on it aren't the same thing, Helena said, and there was something in her voice that was close to blunt. I've seen investigations slow-walked. I've seen evidence get complicated in committee. I've seen... Helena, Vivian said it quietly. I'm just saying that the path from this room to a regulatory action has a lot of places where things can go wrong. I know, Vivian said again, which is why we need to be... The sound was wrong before Ethan could name it. A low mechanical irregularity from outside the hangar, somewhere toward the south end of the property. Not loud, not dramatic, just wrong, the way an engine sound is wrong when it's doing something it shouldn't be. He went to the hangar entrance and looked out. A vehicle was parked at the far end of the airfield, just barely visible, a dark SUV, not an Escalade, nothing he recognized. It had arrived without coming through the gate, which meant it had come across the south perimeter where the fence had buckled. As Ethan watched, it didn't move. It just sat there, on the old runway. Someone's out there, he said. Vivian came to stand beside him. Victor's people? Ethan asked. I don't know. Her voice was careful. Maybe. She paused. Or someone who works with them. Victor wouldn't come himself. That's not how he operates. He sends representatives. The SUV sat without moving for another 2 minutes, then backed up slowly and drove along the perimeter fence line and disappeared around the south corner. Nobody spoke for a moment. They're watching, Helena said. They're watching, Vivian confirmed. Ethan went back inside and looked at the remaining cars. 3 of the 9 had been fully searched. 6 remained. They had what they had so far. Purchase approvals, metallurgical reports, routing records. A cryptic note from someone inside Harmon Colt who'd kept a copy of something. It was substantial. It might not be enough. We work faster, he said. Nobody argued. They pushed through the next 2 days with a controlled urgency that changed the atmosphere in the hangar. Less conversation, sharper focus, each person operating in their lane, Helena on the aircraft components, pulling engine logs and comparing serial sequences and cross-referencing against documents they'd already found. Vivian and Ethan on the remaining cars, systematic and careful. Lily recording every finding with a precision that had started to feel less like an 11-year-old's project and more like the kind of documentation a good paralegal would produce. The Bugatti gave them shipping manifests, a set of Harmon Colt delivery records copied onto plain paper in a hand Ethan didn't recognize, covering shipments to 6 aircraft operators spread across Nevada, California, and Utah. Dates, component batch numbers, quantities, the kind of record that would allow a regulator to identify specifically which aircraft had received, specifically which components from specifically which production run. The Porsche contained something different. 2 CDs in a sealed jewel case. No label. In the camp setup they'd built, there was no way to read them. Vivian put them in her jacket pocket and called a contact in Reno who agreed to receive and image them on a clean system before anyone else touched them. Anything else on those CDs could be useful, Helena said, or it could be personal. Recordings, correspondence. We don't know until we look. We look carefully, Vivian said, and we don't share the contents with anyone outside this room until we know what we have. The Ferrari Enzo, the one with the scratch on its front bumper that had been started but never finished, was the last car they searched, on the morning of the 3rd day. Ethan found the hidden package in the door card the same way he'd found the first one in the Lamborghini, but this package was different. Lighter, smaller. A single sealed envelope containing not documents but a handwritten letter, 2 pages, unsigned but unmistakably in Richard Blackwood's script. He brought it to Vivian without opening it. She read it standing by the hangar entrance in the morning light, and this time Ethan watched her, because he'd come to understand that her reactions to her father's letters, however controlled they appeared, were the most honest thing about her. She read through it twice. When she lowered the pages, her face had the quiet after-weather quality it had carried since the first letter, but underneath it now was something harder and cleaner. Something resolved. He describes a meeting, she said. 6 weeks before the crash. Victor came to his office and asked him directly if he'd found anything in the supplier audits. He says Victor's manner was, She looked at the page. He writes, VB was not concerned. He was performing concern. There is a difference, and I have worked with this man for 15 years, and I know the difference. She paused. My father told him nothing. He said he was still reviewing. Victor left. She looked up. 2 days later, the first component delivery to a new operator was pushed through supply chain on an accelerated timeline. Without my father's sign-off, using a blanket approval he'd signed 6 months earlier for a different program. Victor was moving inventory, Ethan said, getting the components distributed before Richard could flag them. If affected components are already installed in operating aircraft and the supplier is already paid, a regulatory action becomes enormously complicated, Vivian said, versus if he'd caught it before distribution. The cleanup is an order of magnitude harder. Victor was buying time, Helena said from across the room, or closing the window. Both, Vivian said. My father understood this. He writes that after the meeting he accelerated his own timeline. She looked at the letter. He moved the vehicles here. He assembled the documents. He began reaching out to regulatory contacts. She paused. He writes, I do not know how much time I have. Victor is patient. He is also afraid. Afraid men make mistakes, but afraid men with resources are the most dangerous kind because their mistakes are expensive and very hard to see. She folded the letter. He was describing exactly what came for him, she said. Nobody in the room found anything to say to that. Ethan looked at the silver helicopter across the concrete floor. Helena had been working on it for days now, and its panels were open in sections. The engine cowling, a section of the fuselage, access ports he'd never learned the names of, each one photographed and labeled before being opened. It looked less like a preserved aircraft now, and more like something in the process of being understood, which he supposed was accurate. Helena, he said, where are we on the aircraft? Helena set down her notebook. Component analysis is 90% complete. What I have is this. The rotor mass serial number is from the wreckage registry of the 2007 crash. The tail rotor assembly carries 2 component numbers from a second aircraft. Not this one, not the crashed one. A third aircraft registered to a shell company that dissolved in 2008, address in Nevada. She paused. My working conclusion is that prior to the crash, someone performed a partial component swap between this helicopter and the aircraft that actually crashed. Enough identifying components were moved to the crash aircraft that investigators would confirm the identity without looking more carefully. She was quiet for a moment. The crash investigation was 4 months. A thorough investigation of a fatal crash with this much physical destruction should have been 8 to 12 months minimum. Carol moved it through in half the time. Can you prove the swap? Vivian asked. I can prove the component origins don't match the airframe. I can prove the component numbers from the crash wreckage appear in this aircraft. Proving the swap itself, the mechanics of it, when it happened, who performed it, that's beyond what physical evidence alone will give me. She paused. But a component exchange of this type requires an MRO facility, maintenance, repair, and overhaul, certified mechanics, paperwork that was either falsified or destroyed. She picked up her notebook again. Blackwood Aerospace had its own MRO certification, which means Victor had access to the facility and the personnel. Vivian's expression didn't change, but her posture did, something infinitesimally tighter. Who would have done the actual work? Ethan asked. A lead mechanic, an A&P license holder, airframe and power plant. It's the federal certification. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why. Helena paused. Not Victor himself. He's not certified. He'd have needed someone he trusted, someone he had leverage over. That's the person we need to find, Ethan said. The mechanic. Or Hargrove, Vivian said. If Hargrove was inside Harmon Colt and saw what was happening and kept copies, they may know more than just the materials side. They were QC. They would have seen the component distribution chain. She was right. Ethan felt the different threads pulling toward the same center. The mechanic, Hargrove, Carol, the financial routing, all of them attached to Victor Blackwood, who was at this moment presumably sitting in an office at Blackwood Technologies preparing for a board meeting, not yet aware that in a Nevada desert hangar, his brother's daughter and a man who'd paid $87,000 for 11 acres of cracked asphalt were methodically taking apart 17 years of his work. I'm going to make some calls, Vivian said. She picked up her phone and walked toward the exit. Ethan sat down on the workbench and looked at the full array of materials they'd assembled over the past days. The contents of all 9 car concealment points, organized now in dated sequence, each item photographed and logged in Lily's careful record. Purchase approvals. Metallurgical reports. Shipping manifests. Bank routing records. A note from inside the supplier. 2 pages from a lead investigator's retirement that didn't add up. 2 mystery CDs in a jewel case, and a series of handwritten letters from a man who had understood exactly what was coming and had done the only thing he could do about it. He'd built a room that would outlast him. Ethan sat with that for a moment. Then he looked at Lily, who was reviewing her notes at the folding table with the focused economy of someone making sure everything was in order. You okay? He asked. She considered the question with her characteristic delay, not because she didn't understand it, but because she didn't answer things carelessly. It's a lot, she said. But yes. You don't have to be here for all of this. I know. She looked up. I want to be. He held her gaze. She was 11 years old, and she was looking at him with the steady, matter-of-fact quality she'd had since she was about 5. The look that said she'd weighed the situation and made her choice and didn't need it validated. He nodded. Okay. She went back to her notes. Outside, Vivian's voice was low and rapid, conducting the kind of calls that would move things. Ethan didn't know all the territory she operated in, the attorneys, the contacts, the people who owed her or whom she could mobilize, but he understood the shape of it. She was building forward from here. She had the documents, she had Helena's findings, and she was starting to think about what came next. The problem was that Victor would too. It arrived that evening, not unexpectedly, but faster than Ethan had hoped. Vivian's phone rang during dinner. Canned soup again, Lily's efficient routine, and she looked at the number on the screen and went still. Victor, she said. Everyone at the table was quiet. She answered. Victor. Ethan could hear from where he sat the quality of the voice on the other end. Not the words, but the register. Controlled, measured, the voice of a man who was saying something carefully. Vivian listened. She was very still. I see, she said. Then, that's one interpretation. He joined then I'll have my attorney's office contact yours. Then she ended the call and set the phone on the table and sat for a moment looking at nothing in particular. He knows you're here, Ethan said. He knows I purchased a vehicle evaluation service for the property, she said. He has someone monitoring corporate-adjacent transactions, apparently. He doesn't know about the documents. She paused. Yet. She looked at Ethan. He's claiming that the vehicles in this hangar are corporate assets of Blackwood Aerospace that were improperly left off the dissolution inventory. He's threatening to file an injunction to freeze the assets pending a determination. Ethan absorbed this. My attorney says, I know what your attorney says. The deed language is clean, but an injunction is an injunction. Even a frivolous one, it ties things up for weeks. And in those weeks, someone could move evidence. She looked at the documents laid out on the workbench. Or someone could make this building inaccessible. Then we move the documents, Ethan said. Tonight. Out of this building, into secure storage, or already thinking about it, Helena said. She'd been eating her soup quietly throughout the call, but she'd been listening. I have a bonded storage contact in Reno that handles aviation evidence for legal cases. Secure, climate-controlled, legally defensible chain of custody. She looked at Vivian. I can arrange a transfer tomorrow morning. Do it, Vivian said. There's also the aircraft itself, Helena said. The silver helicopter. If Victor files for the assets and an injunction covers the building's contents, the helicopter is included. Nobody had a ready answer for that. We need everything documented before it goes anywhere, Ethan said. The helicopter especially. Every component number, every photograph, everything Helena has found, it needs to be off-site and in the hands of someone credible before any legal action lands. Agreed, Helena said. Give me until 3 in the morning. I can finish the documentation tonight. I'll help, Lily said. Helena looked at her. You'll need to stay awake. I know. Helena appeared to consider this as a qualification rather than a concern. Can you hold a flashlight for 5 hours without moving it? Yes. Then yes, Helena said. You can help. Ethan looked at his daughter, 11 years old, matter-of-fact as the desert, steadier than most adults he'd worked with, and thought that if Richard Blackwood had built a room to last, Lily would have appreciated the architecture of it. I'll drive the transfer run, he said. Whatever needs to go to Reno, I'll take it. Vivian looked at him across the table. They'd been operating in the same building for 4 days, sleeping in trucks and camp setups, eating from cans, working in the merciless fluorescent light, and she'd lost the composed executive bearing somewhere around day 2. Not entirely, not in any way she'd probably acknowledge, but enough that the person sitting across from him now was more legible than the woman who'd arrived in the black Escalade with her suit and her contained, careful face. Victor is going to move quickly, she said. His attorneys will have something filed by Monday. It's Friday night, Ethan said. Yes. Then we have the weekend. She looked at him for a long moment, and in her face, underneath the control, underneath the grief and the anger, and the years of not asking the question she was finally asking, was something that looked a lot like the particular exhaustion of a person who'd been doing everything alone for a very long time and was not yet sure how to stop. "Yes," she said. "We have the weekend." She picked up her soup. Helena picked up hers. Lily had already finished and was reviewing her documentation, making small corrections in her careful handwriting. Ethan looked around the hangar, the 9 cars, uncovered now in all their extraordinary, improbable presence. The silver helicopter, open and patient under Helena's careful work. The folding table with its accumulated record of what one man had known and hidden and trusted the future to find. Outside, the desert was doing what it did at night, going vast and black and full of stars, indifferent and ancient, keeping its own counsel. It had kept this secret for 17 years. It wouldn't have to keep it much longer. Helena finished her documentation at 2:47 in the morning. Ethan knew the exact time because he'd been awake the whole stretch of it, running coffee on the camp stove and watching her work through the helicopter's accessible structures with the focused, unhurried precision of someone who understood that speed and thoroughness were not the same thing, and that in this particular situation, thoroughness was the one that mattered. Lily had lasted until just past midnight, not from lack of will, but from the simple biological ceiling of 11 years old and 4 days of hard, irregular sleep. And Ethan had carried her to the truck and settled her in the back without waking her, and she hadn't stirred. Vivian had stayed up. She sat at the folding table with her laptop and made calls in a low voice to people in different time zones, some of whom answered and some of whom didn't. And she built something on her screen that Ethan didn't ask about because he understood she was doing what she did and he was doing what he did, and the two things were separate operations that served the same end. When Helena finally capped her pen and stood up straight, she rotated her neck twice and said, "That's everything the aircraft can tell me without a full teardown, which we're not doing here." "Is it enough?" Ethan asked. "It's enough to establish that the component serial numbers on this aircraft are inconsistent with its registered history and that those component numbers match physical evidence from the 2007 crash investigation." She put her notebook in her bag. "A court will need an independent verification, but what I have gives any competent attorney a foundation." She looked at the helicopter one last time. "Your father built something solid, Vivian." Vivian looked up from her laptop. She didn't say anything, but she nodded once, and Ethan understood from the angle of it that she was holding something back and had decided to hold it back, and that was her right. They loaded the transfer at 3 in the morning, Ethan's truck and Vivian's Escalade. The documents split between them in identical copies because Vivian had insisted on duplication, and she was right to insist. Original plus 1 copy, separated, so that losing one vehicle on the road didn't lose everything. Helena's camera cards were backed up to 2 separate drives. The maintenance logs were photographed in the originals wrapped in archival sleeves that Helena had in her equipment bag because she was the kind of person who kept archival sleeves in her equipment bag. They drove to Reno in convoy, Ethan leading, arriving at Helena's bonded storage contact just before 7 in the morning as the city was waking up around them. The facility was a converted warehouse in an industrial district, unmarked from outside, which Helena said was deliberate, operated by a man named Garrison, who'd spent 20 years as an evidence custodian for a federal public defender's office before going private. He met them at the loading dock in a canvas work shirt and said very little, which Ethan appreciated. The handoff took 40 minutes. Garrison issued numbered receipts for everything. The chain of custody was established, documented, and clean. Ethan stood outside the loading dock afterward and breathed the cool Reno morning air, which smelled of exhaust and something faintly industrial and nothing like the desert. His back ached from the drive. His eyes felt like sandpaper. He called his attorney at 7:30. Victor Blackwood's legal team filed a preliminary injunction motion Friday night, his attorney said, which was 4 minutes into the call after the preamble. Emailed to the court clerk at 11:45 p.m., because they knew the court wouldn't process it until Monday, but they wanted it in the queue. Ethan had expected this. Grounds? They're claiming the vehicles in your hangar are corporate assets of Blackwood Aerospace Technologies that were inadvertently omitted from the dissolution inventory in 2019. They're arguing that the county's authority to include them in the tax forfeiture sale is questionable and that your deed doesn't cover them. A pause. It's a creative argument. It's also mostly wrong, but creative wrong arguments can take time to defeat. What do we need? Evidence that the vehicles were intentionally placed on that property before the dissolution, with documentation of ownership and intent. If Richard Blackwood put those vehicles there deliberately, and if there's a paper trail establishing that, the dissolution omission becomes less of an accident and more of a question about who had authority to make that call. Ethan looked at Vivian, who was leaning against the Escalade 15 feet away, listening to her own phone call with the contained focus she brought to everything. "We have that," Ethan said. "I'll get it to you today." He sent his attorney photographs of the relevant documents from the McLaren and the Ferrari. Richard Blackwood's own letters establishing that he'd assembled the collection deliberately, stored it deliberately, and made deliberate arrangements for its preservation. His attorney called back 40 minutes later. "This is better than I expected," she said. "I can use this to challenge the injunction's factual basis. It won't dissolve it immediately, but it weakens their position considerably." She paused. "There's something else I need to tell you." "Okay." Victor Blackwood's attorneys have also filed a notice of adverse claim against you personally, not the property, you. They're alleging that you gained access to confidential corporate information through unauthorized entry to a secured facility and that you may have disturbed or relocated corporate assets. Ethan felt a cold clarity settle over him. "That's not what happened." "I know. Your deed covers authorized entry, but they're building a narrative, Mr. Mercer. The adverse claim is probably not going to go anywhere, but it's a message." Her voice was careful and professionally even. "They're saying, we can make this expensive and complicated for you personally, and we will, unless you decide this isn't worth it." He stood on the loading dock of Garrison's warehouse in the early Reno morning and let that sit for a moment. 2 years ago, he'd been sleeping in his truck in a Bakersfield parking lot. A year ago, he'd been doing contract work for $70 an hour and sending Lily to school in shoes that were getting too small. 6 months ago, his mother had died and left him just enough to try one more thing, and he'd looked at government auction sites for commercial property in the middle of the night and found an abandoned airfield in Nevada with a reserve price so low the auction had gone unclaimed twice. He wasn't a man with resources. He wasn't a man with lawyers on retainer or board members to mobilize, or a forensic accountant on speed dial. He was a man with a deed, a daughter, and enough stubbornness to have driven 5 hours into the desert on a bet that something might be there. Victor Blackwood's attorneys were right that they could make this expensive for him. They were wrong about the rest of it. "Tell them no," Ethan said. A pause. "Mr. Mercer, tell them my position is that the deed is valid. The collection is mine under the terms of the sale, and that any further communications should be directed to your office." He paused. "And tell them that certain additional information has been secured in independent legal custody and is being reviewed by relevant parties." Another pause. Longer. "Are you certain about that last part?" "Yes." He could hear her making a note. "All right, I'll respond accordingly." She was quiet for a moment. "What you just told me to communicate? It's true, I assume." "It's true." "Then they'll know they're not dealing with someone they can simply wait out." A pause. "Be careful, Mr. Mercer. That communication will provoke a response." "I know," he said. "That's fine." He hung up and walked over to where Vivian was finishing her own call. She looked at him. "Adverse claim filing? You knew?" "I expected it. Victor's lead attorney, man named Pryor, out of San Francisco, he plays a specific game. First move is always to make the other party feel personally threatened. It's designed to separate people from their resolve." She put her phone in her pocket. "Did it work?" "No." She almost smiled. "Not quite." "Good." She looked at the warehouse behind him. "My attorney says the injunction motion is weak. The omission from the dissolution inventory is difficult to explain given my father's documentation of intent. Victor's team didn't know about those letters. They filed based on the dissolution paperwork alone." She paused. They made a move before they had the full picture. That's a mistake. They were rushed, Ethan said. Someone told them about the property and they reacted fast. Victor reacts fast when he's afraid, she said. My father wrote that. Afraid men with resources make expensive, visible mistakes. She looked at the street. Victor just made one. They drove back to the property separately, arriving within 20 minutes of each other around noon. Lily was awake when Ethan pulled in, sitting in the camp chair outside the hangar eating crackers and reading, her backpack organized beside her in the way she organized everything when they were between established places. Ready to move, but settled where she was. How'd it go? She asked. Good, Ethan said. Documents are secured. She nodded, went back to her book. He sat beside her for a few minutes and drank water and looked at the airfield, at the cracked runway and the tilted fence and the high white Nevada sky pressing down on all of it. And he thought about the phone call from his attorney and the adverse claim filing and the particular feeling of being a target of resources you couldn't match. And he sat with it until the feeling settled into something he could manage. He'd been here before. Not this specific situation, but this specific feeling. The one where someone bigger than you has decided you're a problem and started applying pressure. And the question isn't whether the pressure is real. It is. The question is whether you're built to take it or whether you fold. He'd folded before. He'd like to say he hadn't, but he had, at a specific moment 4 years ago with his former business partner, when the legal pressure had gotten costly and the personal toll had gotten heavy, and he'd accepted a settlement that was bad for him because he was too depleted to keep fighting. He'd lived with that. He still lived with it. He wasn't going to fold again. The phone call from Victor Blackwood came at 3 that afternoon, not through attorneys, not through intermediaries, direct to Vivian's phone, which rang while she was inside the hangar reviewing Helena's documented photographs. And she looked at it for 2 seconds before answering and putting it on speaker so Ethan could hear. Victor Blackwood's voice was nothing like Ethan had expected. He'd built an image of the man. From the documents, from Vivian's descriptions, from 17 years of second-hand understanding, and the image had a voice attached to it that matched, cold, deliberate, possibly theatrical. The voice on the phone was warmer than that, older, slightly tired in the way of a man in his late 60s who'd been carrying something heavy for a while. Vivian, he said, I think it's time we talk directly. We're talking, she said. I mean properly. Face to face. A pause. I know what you found. I know what you think it means. Tell me what you think it means, she said. A long pause. Your father was... He stopped, started again. Richard was brilliant. He was also, at times, paranoid in ways that affected his judgment. The materials analysis he was working on, there were context issues he wasn't accounting for. The alloy discrepancy he identified was within acceptable variance for the application. His own metallurgist had concerns about his methodology. His own metallurgist worked for a company that Victor Blackwood's division was purchasing from, Vivian said. Her voice was level. There's a potential conflict I think you should account for. Silence on the line. Vivian, I loved your father. He was my brother. I know you did, she said. And something in her voice changed slightly, not softening exactly, but acknowledging the real thing that was there, which Ethan understood took something from her. That doesn't change what the documents say, Victor. Documents assembled by a man under enormous stress, who believed he was being persecuted, he was being persecuted, she said. That's fairly well established by the fact that he's dead, and his helicopter is sitting intact in a hangar 17 years after it supposedly burned. A very long silence. I think, Victor said finally, that there are things you don't fully understand, and I think you should hear them before you do something that damages this family irreparably. Come and talk to me then, Vivian said. In person. At the property. Another pause. That's my offer. You come here, you say what you need to say, I'll listen. If you have a legitimate explanation for what's in these documents, I will hear it, I will consider it. Her voice was careful and absolute. But I won't be managed from a distance, Victor. I won't be handled by attorneys and phone calls and adverse claim filings against men who have nothing to do with your decisions. She paused. Come and talk to me. The line was quiet. "I'll think about it," Victor said. He sounded, Ethan thought, like a man doing math in his head. "Don't think too long," Vivian said. "The documents aren't going anywhere. Neither am I." She ended the call. Helena had been standing near the helicopter through all of it, not pretending not to listen. "He's not going to come," she said. "No," Vivian agreed, "but he needed to know that I'd offer it. It changes his next calculation." She set her phone down. "He'll try something else now. He'll try to reach the evidence." "It's in Reno," Ethan said. "He'll try something else then." She was right. It came that night. Ethan woke at 2 a.m. to a smell. Not immediately alarming, just wrong. A faint chemical sharpness underneath the desert's usual mineral dry smell, and something else, something with a petroleum base. He lay still for 3 seconds trying to place it, and then he was out of the truck. He smelled it the moment his feet hit the ground. Fuel. Not engine fuel, not the normal trace smell of a working vehicle. This was stronger and wrong in its location, coming from the south side of the hangar, and as he walked quickly around the building's corner, he could see it. A wet line along the base of the corrugated wall, dark in the moonlight, and the smell heavy and immediate. Someone had cut the auxiliary fuel line on the old underground tank that serviced the hangar's heating system. A tank that hadn't been active in years but still contained residual fuel, and they'd opened the drainage valve and let it run along the building's foundation. The quantity wasn't catastrophic. The tank was mostly empty, and the fuel had pooled rather than spreading far. But pooled aviation fuel at the base of a metal building with electrical systems running inside was not a situation you watched develop. He moved fast. He woke Vivian first. One knock on the Escalade window, 2 words. Fuel leak, and she was out of the vehicle before he'd finished the second word. He ran back to the tank and found the drainage valve, manual, older design, and it had been turned with a wrench. He could see the tool marks on the fitting, and he closed it by hand, his fingers slick with residue. Vivian was already on the phone with the county fire non-emergency line, not 911. There was no fire yet, and 911 brought documentation and investigators and questions about how this happened that they weren't ready to answer publicly. The non-emergency line got them advice and a duty officer who told them to keep the area ventilated and avoid any electrical draw until the fuel dissipated. They cut the breaker to the hangar. They opened both vehicle doors and the personnel entry and let the desert air move through. They worked by flashlight for the next 2 hours, monitoring the dissipation, keeping the space clear. Lily slept through it. Ethan had let her sleep. At 4 in the morning, he sat on the concrete pad outside the hangar entrance, smelling of fuel and sweat, and looked at the desert night. Helena sat beside him. She'd arrived at the sound of activity and had been helping without comment, which was her way. "This is the escalation," she said. "Yeah. They're not just trying to tie up the legal process anymore. They're trying to destroy the evidence." "The evidence isn't here anymore," Ethan said. "It's in Reno. They don't know that, or they know and they can't reach it there, so they're trying to make the whole situation untenable." She was quiet for a moment. A fuel leak at a property with aviation-grade materials and old electrical systems. If it had gone differently, it could have looked like an accident. Ethan thought about that, about the word accident and what it had covered for 17 years. "We need to call the police," Helena said. "Document this." "If we call the police, Victor's attorneys will argue we compromised their injunction process by—" "Ethan." She said his name in the flat, direct way she said things when she wanted him to hear her. "Someone came to this property at night and opened a fuel drain valve at the base of a building where people were sleeping. You, Vivian, your daughter." She paused. "This is not a legal strategy anymore. This is something else." He looked at her. She was right, and he knew she was right. And the part of him that had been managing this as a dispute about property and documents and legacy had to catch up to the part that was sitting outside in the dark, smelling of fuel. He stood up. "I'll call the sheriff's department." "Good. I'll also call Vivian's attorney. She should know this happened before she makes any moves in the morning." He made both calls while the first gray light was beginning above the eastern ranges. The Mineral County Sheriff's Department sent a deputy, a man named Ortega, who arrived at 6 and walked the perimeter with them and looked at the drainage valve and the wet marks on the foundation and the tool marks on the fitting with the careful, non-committal expression of a man who was recording what he saw without yet deciding what it meant. He took photographs. He took statements. He said it would be in his report. "Any idea who might have done this?" he asked. Ethan looked at Vivian. "We're involved in a property dispute," Vivian said. "We've had legal filings in the past 48 hours from an opposing party. I can provide names and documentation." Deputy Ortega wrote this down. He wasn't fast, but he was thorough, and Ethan appreciated that. Victor's next call came through attorneys, as expected, and it arrived not at Vivian's office or Ethan's attorney, but at Garrison's bonded storage facility in Reno. A legal letter demanding access to the materials for inspection on behalf of Blackwood Technologies' pending injunction. Garrison called Vivian's attorney, who called Vivian, who called Ethan. "He found the storage facility," Vivian said. "How?" "Probably followed us from the property to Reno Friday night, where they had someone watching the property and picked up our departure." She was quiet for a moment. "Either way, he knows the documents are out of the building." "He can't access them without a court order," Ethan said. "No, but he can file for one, and he can argue that since the materials are derived from an asset he disputes ownership of, any analysis or transfer of those materials was improper." She paused. "Pryor is good at finding angles." Ethan was standing at the hangar entrance, looking at the dried fuel marks on the south wall, still visible in the morning light, a dark line along the foundation that Deputy Ortega had photographed, and that Ethan had photographed himself 3 times. He kept looking at it. "The fuel line," he said. "What about it?" "That's his mistake," Ethan said. "The legal maneuvering, the injunction, the adverse claim, trying to access the storage facility. That's expensive and slow and complicated, but it's defensible. He can argue he was protecting corporate interests." He looked at the drainage marks. "But someone came here at night and opened a fuel valve while you and I and my 11-year-old daughter were asleep inside. That's not a legal strategy. That's a decision made by a scared man." He paused. "And we have it documented in a sheriff's report." Vivian was quiet on the line. "Use it," Ethan said. "I intend to." A pause. "The board meeting is in 8 days. I need to be in that room with what we have, not in a courtroom fighting Pryor's injunction for the next 3 months." She paused. "I'm going to reach out to 2 federal contacts, one at the FAA, one I know personally who works with the NTSB, not officially, informally first. I want to know if there's an appetite for reopening the Blackwood crash investigation before I walk into a board meeting carrying this. What if there isn't? Then I go to the board anyway." Her voice didn't waver. "But federal interest changes the calculation for the board members. Victor has allies on that board. Some of them will stay allied with him regardless of what I present. But if federal investigators are already moving," she paused, "it becomes a question of who they want to be standing next to when this lands." It was a cold calculation, and it was probably right, and Ethan was glad it wasn't his job to make it. "What do you need from me right now?" he asked. "I need you to hold the property," she said. "Don't leave it unoccupied. If Victor's people came once, they'll come again, and next time they might bring something more than a wrench." He looked at the empty airfield, the cracked runway, the tilted fence, the pale sky. "I'll stay," he said. He brought Lily into that decision honestly, which was how he tried to bring her into everything. He sat her down at the folding table that afternoon and told her what had happened with the fuel line and what it meant, and he watched her process it in her characteristic way. Still, interior, taking the thing apart in her head and looking at the components. "Someone did it on purpose," she said. "Yes, because they're afraid of what we found." "Yes. And you want to stay here?" "Yes. But if you're not okay with that, I'm okay with it," she said. "Lily, I know what you're going to say." She looked at him with the direct, undecorated attention she'd always given him, even when he probably hadn't deserved it. "You're going to say it's your decision, and you'll do what's right for me, and I can go somewhere else if I want to." She paused. "But it's also my decision because I'm here too, and I want to stay." He looked at her. This is important, she said. What you're doing. It's important and it matters and you're doing it right. She said this the way she said everything, flatly, without performance, as a statement of observation rather than reassurance. I'm not going to leave because something got a little dangerous. A little dangerous. A fuel line opened at the base of a building while they slept. Your judgment on what's a little dangerous is 11 years old, he said. My judgment on what's worth doing is also 11 years old, she said, and you've been listening to it. He had. He couldn't argue that. Stay close to the building, he said. Don't walk the perimeter at night. If anything feels wrong, wake me. Obviously, she said, and went back to her book. The next 3 days were a particular kind of tense that Ethan hadn't experienced before. Not the sharp fear tension of immediate threat, but the drawn, grinding tension of a situation that was moving in multiple directions simultaneously and that he couldn't fully see. Vivian was in and out, making trips to Reno and one to Las Vegas to meet with attorneys and contacts, returning each time with new developments that she delivered in the terse, efficient way she had when she was managing several things at once. The FAA contact had listened and been non-committal, but had not dismissed it. The NTSB contact had been more specific. There had been internal questions about the 2007 investigation at the time, never formally pursued, and if someone presented physical evidence that the component serials didn't match, reopening was at least feasible. The word feasible had, apparently, been enough for Vivian. Helena had driven to Tucson, where she'd tracked down Gerald Carroll's retirement address through a combination of public records and a former colleague who owed her a professional favor. She'd called Ethan from outside his house. He knows why I'm there, she said. He opened the door and looked at me and went white. Did he talk? We're talking, she said. It's complicated. He's not a bad man who did a bad thing. He's a weak man who did a bad thing, which is different in some ways and worse in others. She paused. He had a daughter in the hospital in 2007. Very sick. The medical bills were catastrophic. Someone offered him an arrangement. She was quiet. He tells me he didn't know anyone would die. He says the anomaly he closed the investigation on, he genuinely believed it was explainable by operator error. He just closed it faster than he should have and didn't look too hard at the components. A long pause. I don't know if I believe him. Does it matter? Legally, yes. Personally, I don't know. She sighed. He's willing to make a statement. In exchange for some kind of cooperation agreement, he'll need an attorney, which he can't afford, but he'll make a statement. I'll talk to Vivian's attorney, Ethan said. That conversation happened the same evening. Vivian's attorney, a woman named Sue Lynn Park, who'd arrived on the scene 5 days prior and whom Ethan had come to think of as indispensable, listened to the Carroll situation with the rapid, assessing intelligence she brought to everything. If Carroll makes a signed statement about the investigation timeline and the arrangement, even without naming Victor directly, it corroborates the pattern, she said. Combined with the financial routing records your team found, the component serial numbers from Dr. Cross's analysis, and the metallurgical reports from the hidden documents. She paused. I can walk into a federal office with this. Will they move before the board meeting? Vivian asked. Sue Lynn was quiet for a moment. I can't promise a timeline on federal action. What I can do is present the package to the right person and make sure they understand the urgency. Another pause. There's also the ongoing safety issue. If those components are still in operating aircraft, that's the lever, Vivian said. Federal regulators can't sit on an active safety finding. She looked at Ethan across the table. We push on the safety angle first. Regulatory action on the components opens the investigation. The investigation leads where it leads. Ethan nodded. It was right. The safety issue wasn't a legal strategy. It was real. It was the thing Richard Blackwood had died trying to surface. And it was the thing that would move faster than any court filing. He found Hargrove on the 5th day, not through professional licensing or financial records, through a name. N. Hargrove, Helena had said. QC at Harmon Colt. He'd searched the Nevada Business Registry as he'd suggested to Vivian, found the old Harmon Colt registered address in Henderson, and then done something simpler. He called the Henderson Chamber of Commerce and asked if anyone knew former Harmon Colt employees in the materials testing field. The woman on the phone had said she personally knew two people who'd worked there before the restructuring, and one of them had gone into private materials consulting. A woman named Nina Hargrove worked out of a small office in Boulder City. He drove to Boulder City alone on a Thursday afternoon without telling anyone where he was going, because he thought the person who'd left a note inside a McLaren F1 in a locked Nevada hangar might need to see just one person come to her door instead of a team. Nina Hargrove was 61 years old and looked like someone who'd spent 30 years around industrial materials, compact, precise, with the alert, evaluating eyes of a person who looks at things rather than at the surface of things. She opened the door and looked at Ethan for a long moment before speaking. "I wondered if this day would come," she said. "Or I'd stopped wondering about it. I don't know which. Can I come in?" She considered him. "You're not from Victor." "No, I bought the property in Ridgecrest. I found the cars." She stepped back and opened the door. They sat at her kitchen table and she made coffee that Ethan drank without registering the taste, too focused on what she was telling him to notice anything else. She'd been a QC supervisor at Harmon Colt from 2001 to 2009. She'd run the materials testing lab. She'd seen the alloy composition results on the rotor head components and flagged them internally in 2005, 2006, and twice in early 2007. Each time, her flags had been cleared by someone above her with a notation that the discrepancy was within variance guidelines. The variance guidelines they were citing didn't exist, she said. Not in any standard I could find. I made copies of everything, the original test results, my flag reports, the clearances. I kept them in my car, in a folder, because I was afraid of what would happen if I kept them at work or at home. She looked at Ethan. "A man came to see me. March 2007. Mr. Blackwood. Richard. He'd gotten my name somehow. I don't know how. He came to my office after hours and we talked for 2 hours. He had his own test results. They matched mine." She paused. "He asked me to give him the copies. I did. I also kept my own." She looked down at her coffee. "He told me to hold on to them. He said, 'If something happens to me, give them to Vivian.'" Ethan was quiet. "I waited," she said. "I tried to contact Vivian Blackwood twice after the crash, through her company's public channels. I got attorneys both times. They said the company wasn't commenting on ongoing regulatory matters, and any correspondence would be reviewed by legal." She looked up. "I stopped trying. I moved. She stopped. "I told myself I'd done what I could." "You have copies," Ethan said. "I have copies. I need them, and I need you to make a statement to a federal investigator." She looked at him for a long time, and whatever she was weighing in that look, the years she'd been sitting with it, the calls she'd tried and the doors that had closed, the folder she'd kept in her car because she'd been afraid, whatever the weight of it was, it landed. "All right," she said. He drove back to the property with her copies in a sealed folder on the passenger seat, and the window down, and the desert air moving through the truck at 70 miles an hour. And he called Vivian and told her about Nina Hargrove. And when Vivian was quiet for a moment after he'd finished, he understood that the quiet meant something had moved. "She has copies," Vivian said, "her own test results, her flag reports, and the clearances that overrode them, independent of everything your father assembled." He paused. "It's a second chain of evidence. When can she make a statement?" "Whenever you need her. She said she's ready." Another pause. "The board meeting is in 4 days." "I know." "We have enough," Vivian said. Not triumphantly. Not even with relief exactly. Just as a fact stated, the way she stated things. "We have enough to walk into that meeting and into a federal office and not be dismissed." Ethan pulled into the airfield entrance, tires on gravel, the hangar rising ahead of him in the afternoon light. Lily was outside with Helena, helping her label photograph prints that Helena had picked up from a print shop in Ridgecrest. They both looked up when his truck pulled in. He got out. He stood for a moment and looked at the hangar and thought about the man who'd built this archive, systematically, deliberately, in the knowledge that he was running out of time, hiding pieces of the truth in the frames and panels of extraordinary cars in a locked building in the desert, trusting that someone would eventually find it. trusting specifically that Vivian would find it, or that the truth had enough structural integrity to hold up on its own until she did. "Good news?" Lily called from across the yard. "Yeah," Ethan called back. "Good news." She held up a photograph she'd been labeling. "Helena says these are the serial number matches on the rotor mast. She says they're definitive." "She's right," Ethan said. "Come inside when you're done. We need to do some planning." He walked into the hangar. The silver helicopter sat in its faded painted lines, access panels still open from Helena's work, patient and present in the flat afternoon light. He stood in front of it for a moment the way Vivian had stood in front of it the first day she'd walked in, not possessively, not dramatically, just acknowledging it. 17 years, a locked door, a crescent-shaped scratch, and a dead man's archive and a piece of desert nobody wanted. 4 days to the board meeting. He turned around and started getting to work. The night before the board meeting, Ethan couldn't sleep. This wasn't unusual. He'd slept badly for most of the past 2 weeks, the kind of fractured, surface-level rest you get when your body is present, but your mind refuses to fully disengage. But this was different from the other sleepless nights. The previous ones had been driven by urgency, by the forward pressure of things that needed doing. This one was quieter, and in some ways harder, because the work was done. The documents were in Sue Lynn Park's hands, organized into a legal package she'd described as the most comprehensively self-corroborating evidence she'd presented in 22 years of practice. Helena's component analysis was finalized, signed, and submitted to both the FAA and NTSB through the contacts Vivian had reached informally 2 weeks prior, who had since become considerably more formal. Gerald Carroll's signed statement was in the package. Nina Hargrove's independent documentation, her own test results, her flag reports, the clearances that had overridden them, formed a second chain of evidence that existed entirely outside of anything Richard Blackwood had assembled, which meant the two collections confirmed each other in the way that independent witnesses confirm a fact. There was nothing left to do tonight, and so there was nothing to prevent him from simply lying in the truck cab, looking at the Nevada stars through the windshield, and feeling the full weight of the past 3 weeks settle onto him. He thought about the $87,000, his mother's money. The last thing she'd left him, in a will written on a standard form she'd bought at an office supply store because she didn't have an attorney, because she'd never had enough to need one. She'd left him everything she had, and it had amounted to enough for a bet on a piece of desert that nobody else wanted. He thought about sleeping in this truck in a Bakersfield parking lot and telling himself it was temporary. He thought about Lily, at 11 years old, climbing into the same truck at 6 in the morning with her backpack and her book and her gas station burrito and saying, "Okay, Dad." Like trust was a simple thing, like it cost nothing to give. He didn't think he deserved that trust. He hadn't thought so when she gave it, and sitting here with 3 weeks of desert grime and fuel smell and bad coffee and almost no sleep accumulated on him, he still didn't think so. But he tried to be worth it. And there was a difference maybe between deserving something and trying to be worth it. He wasn't sure what the difference was exactly. He just knew he felt it. He got up at 5 and made coffee and watched the sun come up over the eastern ranges. And when Vivian emerged from the Escalade at 6, she looked at him with the particular expression she'd developed over 3 weeks of proximity. Not warm exactly, not the kind of warmth that announces itself, but the kind that's simply there when you look for it. "How are you?" she asked. "Fine," he said. Then, more honestly, "Tired. Nervous." "Me too." She accepted the coffee he handed her. "Both." They stood there for a moment in the early light, drinking coffee on the concrete pad of a Nevada desert airfield, and Ethan thought about how strange it was that the two of them had arrived at this particular moment from such completely different directions. Her from a boardroom and a family legacy and 17 years of grief she'd managed by staying in motion. Him from a truck and a bet. And a daughter who'd never stopped believing he'd eventually figure something out. Different worlds, same desert. "Whatever happens today," he said. "Whatever happens today," she agreed, as if finishing the sentence was unnecessary because they both already knew the rest of it. The board meeting was in Las Vegas, in the Blackwood Technologies Tower on the western edge of the business district. 42 floors of glass and steel that Richard Blackwood had never seen because it had been built 6 years after his death, with money that had been made after Victor restructured the company away from aerospace. Ethan drove separately, which felt right. He wasn't going into the meeting. That was Vivian's territory, her room, her fight to stand in. He was going to be in the building. Sue Lin had arranged for him and Helena to be present in a conference room 2 floors below the board level, available if needed, out of the way if not. He left Lily with a woman named Carla, one of Helena's contacts in Las Vegas, who had agreed without apparent surprise to watch an 11-year-old for the day in a way that suggested Helena had called in this kind of favor before. Lily had been told the basics: board meeting, important, be back by evening, and had accepted this with her characteristic economy. "Text me when it's done," she said. "I will," Ethan said. "Don't forget." "I won't." She looked at him for a moment with those level, assessing eyes. "You did good, Dad," she said. He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say to that which wouldn't feel inadequate. He hugged her. She let him briefly, with the contained tolerance she allowed for physical affection, and then he drove to Las Vegas. The conference room on the 40th floor had a window looking out over the desert basin, and Ethan stood at it for a while after arriving, looking at the city spread below and the desert beyond it, pale and vast, and going all the way to the horizon. Helena sat at the conference table with her laptop, reviewing photographs, doing the thing she did, which was continue working in all available moments. Sue Lin was upstairs. The FAA and NTSB contacts, now operating formally with credentials and process, were in a separate room on the same floor with their own counsel, coordinating what would happen after the board meeting depending on how the board meeting went. The 2 hours they waited felt like something Ethan would not have been able to describe accurately if asked later. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just 2 hours of a room with a view and a woman working at a table and the sound of building HVAC and the distant, muffled city below, and Ethan standing at the window drinking bad conference room coffee and trying not to check his phone every 4 minutes. He checked it every 6 minutes instead. Vivian walked into the board meeting at 10 in the morning carrying a tablet loaded with the photographic record, a bound document package that Sue Lin had prepared, and 17 years of questions she'd stopped asking herself and then started asking again 3 weeks ago in a Nevada desert hangar when she'd pressed her hand to the fuselage of a silver helicopter and felt it solid and real under her palm. She did not feel ready. She hadn't felt ready in any of the moments she'd done the things in her life that mattered most, and she'd long since decided that waiting for ready was how important things didn't get done. There were 9 board members in the room. Victor sat at the far end of the table, which was his habitual position. He'd taken it after Richard's death, when the seating arrangement had reorganized itself around a new center of gravity. He was 71 years old, and he looked at this morning, which was different from the last board meeting 2 months ago, when he'd looked 10 years younger than his age. Something had happened to him in the interval. He'd lost weight he didn't have to lose, and his face carried the particular compression of a man who'd been under pressure he couldn't show. He looked at Vivian when she came in, and she looked at him, and neither of them spoke. She put her materials on the table and said, "I need to present something before we move to regular agenda. I'm invoking my right as majority shareholder to bring an extraordinary item." There was some administrative clearing of throats. The board chair, a woman named Patricia Sell, who'd been in the role for 7 years and whom Vivian trusted as much as she trusted anyone in that room, looked at Victor briefly and then at Vivian. "Of course. The floor is yours." What Vivian presented over the next 90 minutes was not a speech. It wasn't a performance. It was as closely as she could make it what her father would have called a systems presentation. Each component in relation to every other, everything in sequence, everything load-bearing and interdependent. She walked through the physical evidence first, the helicopter, its component serial numbers, Helena's analysis, what the numbers proved about what had and hadn't burned in a Nevada field in 2007. She walked through the documentation from the hangar, purchase approvals, metallurgical reports, shipping manifests, the routing records with their handwritten annotations. She presented Nina Hargrove's independent test results, which predated everything else, and came from inside Harmon Colt itself. She presented Gerald Carroll's statement, which she did without editorial comment, because the facts spoke in a register that editorial comment would only have cluttered. She didn't accuse Victor directly until she had laid every piece of physical evidence, every document, every chain of corroboration in front of the 9 people at that table. Only then did she say his name. Only then did she say, "These approvals carry your signature. These component clearances carry your initials. The payment routing connects to a retainer that connects to the lead investigator who closed the crash investigation in half the standard time. The helicopter my father supposedly died in is intact and in a Nevada storage facility waiting for independent verification." Victor tried to speak twice during the presentation. Both times, Vivian looked at him with the level, absolute patience of someone who had waited 17 years for this room and was not going to be interrupted inside it, and both times he stopped. When she finished, the room was quiet in a specific way, the quiet of people who have received information that has materially changed the context they're operating in and who are still in the process of adjusting. Patricia Sell spoke first. "Victor," she said, "do you want to respond?" Victor Blackwood sat at the end of the table with his hands flat on the surface in front of him, and his face carrying the compressed, weathered look of a man who'd been doing a specific calculation for 3 weeks and had just arrived at the answer. "I'd like to speak with legal counsel before making any statement," he said. It was, Ethan thought later when Vivian described it to him, both the smartest and the most damning thing he could have said. Smart because it was legally correct. Damning because 9 board members watched him say it in response to his niece's presentation about his brother's death, and not one of them in that room was under any illusion about what it meant. Patricia Sell called a recess. The board reconvened 40 minutes later without Victor, who had left with his attorney. What happened in the next 3 hours was the kind of institutional process that moves slowly and then all at once, like a geological thing, like a fault line that holds and holds and holds and then doesn't. The board voted to suspend Victor from all executive and board functions pending an independent review. They voted to engage outside counsel. They voted, at Vivian's specific and prepared proposal, to immediately notify the FAA of the affected component shipments and to cooperate fully with any federal investigation. The last vote was 11-0, which was possible because Victor had already left, and because the 9 members present understood that the only safe position available to them was the correct one. Sue Lynn Park walked into the 40th floor conference room at 2:40 in the afternoon. She set her tablet on the table and looked at Ethan and Helena. "Board suspended Victor and voted to cooperate fully with federal investigation," she said. "FAA and NTSB representatives are meeting with Vivian and the board chair now. The component recall notice will go out through regulatory channels today." She paused. "It's done." Helena looked up from her laptop. She didn't say anything. She nodded once, the same 2-finger salute she used for good morning. Ethan sat with it for a moment. The window, the desert, the city below. "Is Vivian okay?" he asked. Sue Lynn considered this. "She's working," she said. "So, yes, for her." He understood that. What happened in the weeks after moved in the way consequential things move. Not smoothly, not cinematically, but with the grinding, intermittent, sometimes maddening pace of systems that were not built for speed. Federal investigators formally reopened the Blackwood crash investigation. The FAA issued a priority airworthiness directive covering the affected component batches, which triggered inspections across 4 commercial operators and 2 private aviation clients, 17 aircraft in total, 11 of which were found to have Harmon Colt rotor head components from the flagged production runs still installed. None of those aircraft had experienced catastrophic failure, which was either luck or the specific stress load conditions that would have triggered failure having never coincided in the right combination. The margin had been real, and it had held, and the people who'd flown those aircraft and the people who'd ridden in them would never know how close the margin had been. The NTSB's formal re-examination of the 2007 crash began with Helena Cross as a consulting expert, which she accepted without ceremony and conducted with the same focused, unhurried thoroughness she'd brought to the desert hangar. Gerald Carroll's cooperation agreement, negotiated by Sue Lynn's office with federal prosecutors, resulted in his full testimony about the arrangement he'd accepted in 2007, the name of the intermediary who'd contacted him, and the source of the funds. The funds traced back through two shell companies and a Nevada LLC that had been dissolved in 2010 to a discretionary account that Victor Blackwood had controlled as VP of Supply Chain Operations. Victor was charged with federal counts that Ethan couldn't recite from memory and didn't try to. What he understood was the shape of it: fraud, obstruction, and a set of charges related to the component approvals that the federal prosecutors had spent 4 weeks building into a coherent case. Victor's attorney negotiated. The negotiations were long and, by all reports, difficult. Victor was 71 years old and not in good health, and whatever deal eventually emerged, it did not include Ethan's involvement, which was exactly right. That part wasn't his. What was his was the property. The legal challenge to his deed had collapsed in stages. First, when Sue Lin demonstrated that Victor's filing had misrepresented the dissolution record. Then when the court reviewed Richard Blackwood's own documentation of intent and found the contents therein argument unambiguous. And finally, when Blackwood Technologies' new interim board, operating under Vivian's direction, formally withdrew the injunction and the adverse claim. The withdrawal was filed on a Tuesday morning, and Ethan's attorney called him with the news at 11 a.m., and he was standing in the hangar when the call came, and he sat down on the workbench and felt the full weight of it. Clean title. 9 supercars, 3 helicopters, one of which wasn't his, and he'd always known it wasn't his. He called Vivian that afternoon. "The silver helicopter," he said. "I know," she said. "What do you want to do?" She was quiet for a moment. "The deed covers it. Legally, it's yours." "I know," he said. "What do you want to do?" Another pause. And in the pause was the thing about Vivian Blackwood that Ethan had come to understand over weeks of proximity. That beneath the executive control and the careful management of everything, she felt things the same way anyone felt things, maybe more so, because she'd spent so long not letting it show that the feelings had nowhere to go but deeper. "I want to restore it," she said. "My father built it. He flew it. I want it to fly again." A pause. "Would you accept a purchase?" "Fair market value. Independently appraised." "No," Ethan said. Silence. "I would accept it as the asset it is," he said. "Part of the estate your father assembled. You're his heir, not me. That one goes back to you." He paused. "The other 8 cars and 2 helicopters are mine. That one's yours. That seems right." She was quiet for a long moment. "You don't have to do that." "I know." "The appraisal on that aircraft." "I don't need it," he said. "I have enough." He did. Dave Gutierrez had completed his full appraisal, and the total value, confirmed by 2 independent appraisers subsequently engaged by the court process, came in at $34 million for the 8 remaining vehicles and 2 helicopters, net of a legal fund Ethan had set aside for Sue Lin's fees, which had been substantial. After taxes, which his new accountant had walked him through with the careful clarity of someone explaining something important to a person who'd never had to think about it before, he had more than he'd ever had in his life by a factor he genuinely couldn't absorb in a single sitting. He'd sat with the final figure for 3 days before it stopped feeling theoretical. He didn't spend any of it immediately, which surprised people who assumed they understood what a man who'd slept in his truck would do when he stopped having to sleep in his truck. He set up a basic account for Lily's education that he funded first, because that was the non-negotiable. Then he made a list. The list had one item on it: Mercer Desert Aviation and Motors. He'd been thinking about it since the second week at the property, when he'd stood on the cracked runway in the late afternoon light and looked at the airfield's dimensions and thought about what it had been built for and what it could be again. Not what it was. He wasn't trying to reconstruct the past, but what it could become. A working facility, aviation maintenance, classic vehicle service, storage for serious collectors who needed a desert climate and professional care. He knew the work. He knew engines and systems and the specific disciplined patience required to restore something that's been left to deteriorate. He knew what it felt like to be a thing that had been left to deteriorate. The renovation took 8 months. He hired a structural engineer first, then a contractor who specialized in industrial buildings, then a licensed electrician who spent 3 weeks rewiring the hangar's systems from scratch. He reactivated the water line with a county permit. He poured new concrete on the southeast pad. He had the runway assessed and found it structurally sound under the weathering, which saved him a significant sum. The fence came down in sections and went back up properly, and the control tower, which the structural engineer had described as a project and the contractor had described as a commitment, and Ethan had described as the thing he was most interested in doing, was rebuilt from its existing steel frame outward, 2 stories, functional, with windows that actually kept the weather out. He enrolled Lily in school in Ridgecrest that fall, 40 miles away, which meant a drive he made every morning without complaint because the school was good and the science teacher was exceptional, and Lily had opinions about educational quality that Ethan had learned over 11 years of proximity to take seriously. She didn't complain about the drive either. She brought her book and read in the truck and told him things about what she was learning with the same flat, precise enthusiasm she brought to information she found worth reporting. She'd started a project on aviation safety systems that her teacher had encouraged her to develop into a science fair submission. She'd interviewed Helena Cross by video call for 45 minutes and come away with 3 pages of notes. She said I could shadow her on a component inspection next year, Lily told Ethan on the drive home one afternoon. If you're okay with it. I'm okay with it, Ethan said. Good. She went back to her book. He thought sometimes about the shape of the past year. Not as a story, not in the constructed way that events become narratives after the fact, but as a physical thing, like a piece of terrain you've crossed, and are now looking back at from the far side. The distances were hard to account for. Not just the distance from the Bakersfield parking lot to the Nevada airfield, from the $43 wallet to the accountant's final figure, from the man who'd folded under pressure 4 years ago to the man who'd told Victor Blackwood's attorneys no and meant it. Those distances were real, but they weren't the ones he thought about most. He thought about the distance between what a thing looks like and what it is. He'd bought 11 acres of cracked desert and a rusting hangar, and everyone who'd looked at it had seen the rust, the decay, the absence of utility. A man who'd run out of options taking a bad bet because he had no better options available. That's what it had looked like. And it was also true. Both things at the same time. What nobody had seen, what he himself hadn't seen when he'd signed the deed in the county clerk's office in Ridgecrest, was that the thing had integrity. Structural integrity, in the way Richard Blackwood had meant it. A room built to last, built to hold weight, built by a man who understood that the truth doesn't need to be in a position of strength to survive. It just needs a room to sit in long enough for someone to come open the door. Ethan thought about that sometimes when he was working in the hangar, which he was doing most days by then. Real work. The kind with tools, with his hands, with the satisfying, unglamorous physicality of making something functional that had stopped being functional. He wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't going to become one. He had a working facility and a stable income and a daughter who was going to be okay. And that was the exact inventory of what he'd been trying to assemble for 3 years. And he had it. The morning Vivian came to take the silver helicopter, it was early October, the desert cooling toward fall. The sky, that particular deep Nevada blue that only happens when the summer heat has finally let go. She'd had the aircraft fully restored by an MRO facility that Helena had recommended, people who knew what they were doing and who'd treated the project with the seriousness it warranted. It had taken 4 months. The airframe was structurally sound, the rotor system had been inspected and certified on its own merits, independent of any compromised components. The interior had been cleaned and refurbished to as close to its 2004 original configuration as the restorers could achieve. It was silver white and clean in the morning light, sitting on Ethan's repaved pad, and it looked like something that had come back from somewhere far away. He stood beside it when Vivian arrived. She was different from the woman who'd walked through the hangar entrance 11 months ago in the charcoal suit and the careful face. Not dramatically different. She hadn't been remade, hadn't been softened into someone she wasn't, but there was something less compressed about her, like a fist that had been held closed for a long time, finally opened. Not fully. Probably not fully for a while. But enough. She walked up to the helicopter and stood in front of it, and she pressed her hand flat to the fuselage the same way she'd done that first day. Not claiming it, just confirming it was real. "Ready?" Ethan asked. "Almost," she said. She reached into her jacket and took out a folded piece of paper. One of her father's letters. He recognized the fold. and she put it inside the cabin on the passenger seat and closed the door. He didn't ask what it said. That was hers. She went through the pre-flight with a thoroughness that Richard Blackwood would have recognized. She'd gotten her pilot's license at 22, renewed every year since, and she was methodical about it in the way of someone who understood that confidence without data was the most dangerous thing in engineering. When she was done, she looked at Ethan over the nose of the aircraft. "Thank you," she said. It was direct and unadorned, the way she said things when she meant them completely. "Your father did the work," Ethan said. "I just opened the door." She looked at him for a moment. "You stayed," she said. "That's not nothing." He thought about that, about all the ways you could be present or absent in a situation, about the difference between witnessing something and participating in it, about the choice. And it was a choice, every day, in every direction, to stay. "No," he said. "It's not nothing." She got in. He stepped back. The rotors turned, first slowly and then with increasing authority, and the sound built from a mechanical whisper to a full-throated roar that Ethan felt in his sternum. The helicopter lifted, not fast, not dramatically, with the measured patience of a machine that knew how to do the thing it was built for, and cleared the pad and rose into the Nevada morning. He watched it go. It banked west over the airfield, crossing the cracked runway and the repaired fence line and the rebuilt control tower, and then it climbed into the blue desert sky and got smaller and smaller until it was a silver point against the morning, and then the morning absorbed it, and it was gone. He stood on the concrete pad for a while in the quiet that came after the rotor sound faded. The desert made its desert sounds, wind in the creosote, something distant and mineral, the absolute indifferent silence of a place that was here before any of this and would be here after. He'd stopped finding the silence empty. It had taken time, but he'd come to understand that silence isn't absence. It's the condition in which things can be heard. Lily came out of the hangar behind him, wiping her hands on a shop rag. She'd been helping him sort a new parts delivery all morning, which she'd been doing on weekends for 6 months with a focused competence that made the work go significantly faster. "She's gone?" she asked. "Yeah." Lily stood beside him and looked at the empty sky. "Did it go the way you hoped?" He thought about the question honestly, the way it deserved. "Better," he said, "and worse, at the same time." She considered this. The worst part being that a man died and it took 17 years in an abandoned airfield and someone's last $87,000 to find out what actually happened. "Yeah," he said. "That part." She was quiet for a moment. "And the better part?" He looked at the airfield, at the runway and the fence and the control tower and the hangar behind them, with its new electrical and its clean floor, and the 2 remaining helicopters inside that were in the early stages of restoration. At 11 acres of Nevada desert that had looked like nothing from the outside. "We found it," he said. "Someone built something to last, and we found it, and it lasted." She thought about this. She had the look she got when she was integrating something, not just filing it away, but actually working it into the structure of what she understood. Then she nodded once, the way she always nodded when she'd arrived somewhere. "Okay," she said. "I'm going back to the parts inventory." "I'll be right there," he said. She went inside. He heard the hangar resume its sounds. Tools, movement, the radio she'd started playing while they worked, low and in the background. A habit she'd developed in the past months that he hadn't commented on because he liked it. He took one more look at the sky where the silver helicopter had been. There were things he'd learned in the desert that he hadn't expected to learn. Some of them were about evidence and systems and the architecture of truth, which was what he'd have said if someone asked him to summarize. But under those things were smaller ones, the ones that actually mattered and that were harder to put words to. That showing up is not the same thing as being ready, but it counts for more. That the people who build rooms for the truth to wait in are not always the people who get to see the truth land. Sometimes the room is what you leave. Sometimes that has to be enough. That a daughter who says, "Okay, Dad in the early morning dark is not giving you her trust because you've earned it. She's giving it to you because she's decided to, which is different and heavier, and the only version of trust that means anything." that $87,000 and 11 acres of cracked desert can be, depending on what's inside them, the most consequential thing you ever own. That the locked door is not an obstacle to the truth. It's where the truth lives, waiting. He turned around and went back to work. Inside the hangar, his daughter was counting parts and humming something under her breath that he didn't recognize. And the two helicopters sat in their bays in various states of disassembly and becoming. And the Nevada light came through the high windows and lay across the concrete floor in long, clean rectangles. And outside the desert went in every direction to the horizon, patient and enormous, and full of things that had been waiting a long time to be found. Some of them were still waiting. Ethan Mercer was in no particular hurry. He had the room.